Headphone 30-second hook. This is a story about a land, a people, and a ruler whose memory has passed through history in ways that are often misunderstood. We will not tell it with fear or with legend, but slowly, with patience and in quiet detail. This is the story of Vlad the Impaler, known later as Dracula. We begin not with him, but with the land in which he lived, the valleys, the rivers, and the mountains of Wallachia and Transylvania on the edge of 15th-century Europe. Open Book, Chapter 1. Geography and background of Wallachia and Transylvania, the region known as Wallachia, in the 15th century was situated between the Carpathian Mountains to the north and the Danube River to the south. To the west lay the Kingdom of Hungary, and to the east and southeast stretched the rising power of the Ottoman Empire. The geography of Wallachia was one of boundaries, crossroads, and natural features that determined settlement, trade, and military movement. The Carpathian Range was not a uniform wall of stone, but a series of ridges, valleys, and forested slopes. The mountains provided timber, pasture for livestock during the summer months, and mineral resources that were of growing importance. The southern slopes opened gradually into foothills and plains. These plains extended toward the Danube, a river that not only divided but also connected territories. The Danube was both a barrier and a highway. In the 15th century, it carried merchants, soldiers, fishermen, and travellers. Seasonal floods shaped the lowlands, making some areas fertile but others prone to marshes and disease. Climate influenced life in these regions. Winters were long, often marked by snow that made roads difficult to pass. Villages became isolated in colder months with movement restricted to sledges or slow marches. Summers brought heat, but also fertile growth for grains, such as wheat, rye and barley. Livestock raising, especially of sheep, goats and cattle, was common. Vineyards existed in sheltered valleys, producing wine in modest quantities. The land was not heavily urbanized. Most settlements were small villages, clusters of wooden houses with thatched roofs, often built along rivers or at the edges of forests. Larger towns developed around trade routes or near fortresses. These fortresses, built of stone in Transylvania and more often of wood and earth in Wallachia, marked not only military points but also administrative centres. Roads were rudimentary, often little more than beaten paths, subject to weather and seasonal change. Merchants and armies alike travelled slowly, and distances that today seem short required days or weeks to cross. The natural environment shaped political boundaries. Wallachia itself was divided into several districts or judites, each governed by local boyars, the landed nobility. These boyars drew wealth from agriculture, peasant labour, and occasional trade. Their estates stretched across fertile plains or mountain valleys, and their loyalty was often uncertain, as they shifted support between rival princes or foreign powers. Transylvania, lying north of Wallachia, was part of the Kingdom of Hungary, but possessed its own local identity. It was a land of Saxon settlers, Hungarian nobles, and Romanian peasants divided into seats and counties, with privileges granted by the Hungarian crown. Its fortified towns, such as Sibiu and Brasov, became important centres of trade, connecting the Danube frontier with Central Europe. Merchants carried salt, grain, hides, timber and iron along these routes. The Saxon towns also produced written records, chronicles and pamphlets that later shaped European perceptions of Wallachia and its rulers. The frontier character of this region was important. To the south, across the Danube, lay the Ottoman Empire, expanding steadily during the 15th century under the rule of Murad II and later Mehmed II. Ottoman garrisons, markets and fortresses were positioned along the river, facing the Wallachian side. Tributary relations, raids and negotiations were constant. The Danube frontier was not a fixed line, but a zone of shifting influence where tribute payments, military incursions and alliances decided control. Weather, travel and subsistence defined the rhythm of life. Villages tilled fields with wooden ploughs drawn by oxen. Harvests were stored in granaries made of wood and clay. Clothing was simple, wool, linen and fur in the winter months. Trade in salt from Transylvanian mines was significant, as salt was necessary for preserving food. Honey and beeswax were also valuable products. Taxes collected from peasants often came in the form of grain, livestock or labour, rather than coin. This background of land, climate and society formed the setting into which Vlad III was born. Wallachia was not an isolated place. No, it was connected by roads and rivers to neighbouring powers. Yet it remained vulnerable to them. Geography created both opportunity and weakness. The mountains provided defence but also isolation. The plains gave fertile soil but opened routes for invasion. The Danube was both a protection and a threat. These conditions, slow, persistent, and unchanging through decades, framed the struggles of Wallachia's princes and the lives of its people. Part 1. The land and its natural features. Wallachia in the 15th century was a principality situated between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River. Its territory, though not large by modern standards, was significant because of its position between larger and more powerful neighbours. Geography shaped the history of this land, and to understand the life and times of Vlad III, it is necessary to begin not with his family or his actions, but with the natural and human environment in which he lived. The Carpathian Mountains formed a northern boundary. These mountains were not uniform, but a series of ranges, ridges, and valleys. The southern slopes of the Carpathians gave way gradually to hills and plains, making Wallachia a transitional landscape. The highlands provided timber, pasture land, and mineral deposits, while the lowlands supported agriculture. The mountains were heavily forested. Oak, beech, and fir were common. These forests supplied wood for houses, for fortifications, and for fuel. They also provided hunting grounds for nobility and for common villagers. Game included deer, wild boar, and occasionally bear. The presence of these forests made movement difficult, but they also offered protection from invading armies. The Danube formed the southern boundary. It was both a barrier and a route of communication. In spring, the river often flooded, spreading into low-lying areas and creating marshes. Flooding fertilized certain lands, but also caused difficulties for settlement. The Danube was navigable in this region and served as a line of commerce and of war. Boats carried grain, salt, and livestock downstream, while merchants and soldiers travelled upstream to the markets and fortresses along its banks. Fishing was common, with sturgeon and carp being among the species caught. River fish supplemented diets, particularly during periods of fasting, observed by Orthodox Christians. Between the mountains and the river lay plains, valleys, and rolling hills. These were the heartlands of Wallachia. The soil varied. In some areas it was fertile, supporting wheat, barley, and rye. In other areas it was sandy or clay-heavy, making agriculture more difficult. Agricultural productivity depended heavily on weather conditions, so rainfall was uneven, with some years bringing drought and others heavy rains that ruined crops. Climate was continental, with cold winters and warm summers. Winters brought snow that often blocked roads and isolated villages. Summers could be hot, but the growing season was sufficient for grain, vegetables, and fruits. Agriculture was the foundation of daily life. Fields were tilled with wooden ploughs, usually drawn by oxen. Iron ploughshares were known, but they were expensive and less common. Wheat and rye were staples. Barley was grown for both food and for brewing. Millet and oats were also cultivated. Gardens near villages produced onions, garlic, beans, and cabbage. Fruit trees such as apple, plum, and cherry were planted, providing fruit for fresh use and for drying. Plums in particular were important, as they were dried or fermented into brandy. Grapevines grew in certain valleys, producing wine in modest amounts. Livestock raising supplemented agriculture. Sheep were kept in large numbers as they provided wool, milk, and meat. Goats, cattle, and pigs were also common. Horses were important not only for agriculture and transport, but also for military purposes. Peasant households often kept chickens, geese, and ducks. Beekeeping was widespread. Honey was used as a sweetener, and beeswax was valuable for candles, especially for churches. The seasons shaped the rhythm of life. Spring meant ploughing and sowing. Summer was a time of tending fields and livestock. Autumn brought the harvest, which had to be gathered and stored carefully. Winter was a quieter season, but also harsh, with cold weather, short days, and the need to survive on stored food. Food shortages were not uncommon during late winter and early spring. Famine could result from poor harvests, raids, or excessive taxation. Settlement patterns reflected the geography. Villages were small, often consisting of wooden houses with thatched roofs. Houses were made of logs or wattle and daub with earthen floors. Heating came from central hearths. Smoke sometimes escaped through a hole in the roof rather than a chimney. Villages were clustered near rivers or streams, providing water for people and animals, ammuta. Wells were dug, but river water was more common. Towns were fewer and smaller than in Western Europe. Larger settlements developed near fortresses or along trade routes. These towns served as markets, where peasants brought surplus produce to exchange for salt, iron tools, or imported goods. Transylvanian towns such as Brasov and Sibiu were larger and more developed, with stone houses, guilds, and fortified walls. Wallachian towns were smaller and less fortified, though Targovist, the capital at various times, served as both a political and economic centre. Fortresses were essential in this frontier region. In Wallachia, many were made of earth and wood, reinforced with palisades. Some stone fortresses existed, especially in mountain passes or on strategic riverbanks. These fortifications were not only military structures, but also symbols of authority. Nobles and princes used them to assert control over territories. In Transylvania, fortified towns were more common, reflecting the influence of Saxon settlers and Hungarian rulers. Their walls, towers, and gates provided defense against raids. Roads and communication were limited. Main routes followed river valleys or mountain passes. Roads were often unpaved, muddy in spring and dusty in summer. Carts drawn by oxen or horses were slow, and travel was difficult in winter. Communication between villages and towns depended on messengers travelling these routes. Important routes connected Wallachia to Transylvania across the Carpathians and to the Danube ports for trade with the Ottoman Empire and beyond. The strategic position of Wallachia meant that it was often a zone of conflict. Armies from the Ottoman Empire crossed the Danube, while Hungarian and sometimes Polish forces entered from the north. Geography shaped the tactics of these campaigns. Armies moved along rivers or roads through valleys. Dense forests and swamps provided natural defences, but also hindered local populations. Religion shaped settlement patterns as well. Churches were built in villages and towns, usually of wood in smaller settlements and of stone in more important ones. Monasteries were constructed in secluded valleys or near important routes. These monasteries not only served religious functions, but also acted as centres of literacy, record-keeping, and local authority. Thus, the geography of Wallachia and Transylvania created a landscape that was both fertile and fragile, connected and isolated, defended and exposed. It was in this land of mountains, rivers, forests and plains that Vlad III was born, and it was this environment that shaped the possibilities and limits of his reign. Part 2. Climate, daily life, trade and fortifications. The climate of Wallachia in the 15th century was continental. Winters were long and cold, while summers were warm to hot and often humid. Spring and autumn were transitional, with unpredictable weather. This pattern of seasons shaped the cycles of agriculture, settlement and warfare. Winters began in late November or early December and extended until March. Snow was common, covering fields and roads for weeks at a time. Rivers sometimes froze, allowing movement across ice but halting navigation. Villages became isolated. Travel was difficult as carts and horses struggled through snow and only sledges provided an alternative. The cold required stores of firewood which had to be gathered and stacked during the autumn. Poor households sometimes ran short of fuel. Long nights, short days and limited food supplies made winters hard. Clothing in this season consisted of woolen tunics, cloaks and sheepskin coats. Fur from foxes, wolves or bears was used by wealthier households. Spring brought thaw, melting snow and floods in lowlands. Roads turned to mud. Streams and rivers overflowed. This was also the season of ploughing and sowing. Fields had to be prepared quickly, with oxen dragging wooden ploughs. Delays could mean poor harvests later in the year. Early crops such as barley and oats were sown first, while wheat followed. Spring was often a season of hunger, as winter stores ran low before the new harvest. Summers were warmer, crops grew. Livestock grazed in pastures, and peasants tended fields and gardens. Droughts sometimes occurred, damaging harvests. Too much rain, however, could also ruin crops, especially in low-lying areas prone to flooding. Disease among livestock was a risk in the warmer months, with epidemics spreading through herds. Autumn was the season of harvest. Wheat, rye and barley were gathered. Fruits were collected from orchards, and grapes were pressed for wine. Livestock were brought in from mountain pastures. Food stores were replenished for the winter. Grain was placed in granaries, often wooden structures sealed with clay. Meat was salted or smoked. Vegetables were stored in pits. Eatables were stored in pits. This was also the time for taxes to be collected, either in grain, livestock or coin, depending on agreements with local rulers. Famine was a recurring danger. Poor harvests, raids or heavy taxation could reduce supplies. Chronicles occasionally mention years of hunger. In such times, people relied more heavily on roots, nuts and forest products. Hunting and fishing offered some relief, but famine remained a constant risk in pre-modern agriculture. Daily life for peasants followed these seasonal cycles. Housing was modest. Most homes were single-room structures of wood or wattle and daub, with thatched roofs. Floors were made of packed earth. A central hearth provided heat and cooking space. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or through crude chimneys. Furniture was simple. Wooden benches, tables and chests. Bedding consisted of straw, wool blankets or animal skins. Clothing was practical. Linen shirts and woolen tunics were common. Women wore long dresses with aprons. Men wore trousers and tunics belted at the waist. Footwear was made of leather, sometimes rawhide, of fruit. In winter, heavier garments of wool or fur were worn. Clothing was homespun produced locally, with dyes from plants or minerals giving muted colours. Brightly coloured garments were rare and associated with nobility. Food was basic and repetitive. Bread made from rye, barley or wheat formed the staple. Porridge from millet or oats was common. Beans, cabbage, onions and garlic were important vegetables. Dairy products from sheep, goats and cows provided milk, cheese and butter. Meat was eaten less frequently, often on feast days. Pork, mutton and poultry were the most common meats. Fish was important, especially during religious fasts. Orthodox practice required fasting on many days of the year, with abstention from meat and dairy, which made fish, vegetables and bread more significant. Salt was necessary for preservation and was obtained from Transylvanian mines. Honey provided sweetness and ale or weak beer was brewed in villages. Wine was produced in limited quantities in valleys with vineyards. Farming routines dominated peasant life. Men and women both worked in the fields. Children contributed by tending animals, gathering firewood, or guarding crops from birds and animals. Tools were simple wooden ploughs, sickles, scythes and hoes. Iron tools were valuable but not always available. Oxen and horses provided labour for ploughing and transport. Markets offered opportunities for exchange. Peasants travelled to nearby towns with surplus produce. They sold grain, livestock, wool, honey or hides. In return, they bought salt, iron tools, pottery, cloth or imported goods. Markets were held on fixed days, often near churches or fortresses. Larger towns, such as Brasov or Sibiu in Transylvania, were centres of long-distance trade, connecting Wallachia with Central Europe. Merchants from Saxon towns traded textiles, metal goods and wine, while Wallachians supplied livestock, hides and grain. The Danube linked Wallachia to Ottoman markets where traders exchanged Balkan and Anatolian goods. Fortresses and border defences were a prominent feature of the region. In Wallachia, fortresses were often made of wood and earth, with palisades, ditches and earthen ramparts. These structures provided refuge during raids but were vulnerable to fire and siege. Stone fortresses existed in strategic locations, especially in mountain passes. They served as military strongholds and as centres of administration for princes and boyars. In Transylvania, fortifications were more developed. Saxon towns built stone walls with towers and gates. These towns, such as Brasov, defended themselves against raids and also functioned as centres of trade and record-keeping. Nobles in Hungary maintained castles of stone, while monasteries sometimes fortified their enclosures. Border defences against the Ottoman Empire were particularly important. The Danube frontier was lined with forts and watchtowers, some on islands, others on high banks. These outposts observed Ottoman movement and signalled danger. Crossing points were guarded. Tributary relations with the Ottomans often determined whether these defences were maintained or neglected. The physical and social environment of Wallachia was therefore one of modest villages, seasonal agriculture, limited trade and fragile defences. It was a land exposed to natural difficulties and external threats. Life was repetitive, marked by the rhythms of weather, harvest and taxation. It was into this setting that the boyars competed for power, and into which Vlad III would be born, inheriting both the land and its challenges. Part 3. Roads, architecture, and religious life. The movement of people, goods, and armies in 15th-century Wallachia and Transylvania depended on roads and travel routes that were shaped by geography, climate, and human labor. There were no paved highways comparable to Roman roads or later European networks. Instead, there were tracks, paths, and seasonal routes. These routes followed natural corridors, such as river valleys and mountain passes, because steep terrain and dense forests limited other options. Roads across the Carpathians connected Wallachia with Transylvania. These passes, including the Bran Pass and the Rukar-Bran corridor, were of strategic importance. Merchants, messengers, and soldiers used them, but they were narrow and often dangerous. Heavy rains turned them to mud, while winter snows made them impassable. Travel required patience and time. Caravans moved slowly, with ox-drawn carts carrying goods. Merchants sometimes travelled in groups for safety, as raids and banditry were risks. Within Wallachia, roads linked villages to market towns and towns to fortresses. These were not fixed in the modern sense. Tracks shifted with use, erosion, and seasonal flooding. Bridges existed, but were often temporary, built of wood and subject to decay. Larger rivers required ferries or fording in shallow places. Crossing the Danube involved boats, barges, or ferries, sometimes controlled by local lords or by Ottoman garrisons on the opposite bank. Travel was slow. A distance of 20 to 30 kilometers might require a full day. Messengers on horseback were faster, but conditions limited speed. Seasonal rhythms determined movement. Spring floods restricted travel, while summer heat and dust slowed it. Autumn was more favorable, though harvest work reduced available labor for travel. Winter froze rivers but blocked mountain routes. Architecture reflected local resources and needs. In villages, houses were built from timber, clay, and straw. The simplest houses were one-room structures with walls of wattle and daub supported by wooden frames. Roofs were thatched with reeds or straw. Floors were of earth, sometimes covered with mats. Heating came from central hearths. Wealthier peasants might have slightly larger houses with separate areas for cooking and sleeping. Outbuildings stored tools, grain, or livestock. In towns, architecture showed more variation. Wooden houses were still common, but merchants and craftsmen sometimes built with stone or brick. These houses had 2 stories with storage or workshops on the ground floor and living quarters above. Roofs of wooden shingles or tiles replaced thatch in towns. Streets were narrow and unpaved, with open drains for waste. Fire was a constant risk, as wooden structures were vulnerable. Fortresses displayed another architectural style. In Wallachia, many fortifications were of earth and wood, constructed quickly and maintained with difficulty. Palisades of timber surrounded ditches and ramparts. Towers of wood served as lookouts. In Transylvania, fortresses and towns had stronger stone defences. Walls of limestone or sandstone enclosed towns like Brasov, with towers at intervals and gates reinforced with iron. Nobles built castles on hills, with keeps, walls, and courtyards. These fortresses were symbols of authority and provided refuge in times of attack. Monasteries also contributed to architecture. Built of stone when resources allowed, they were often located in secluded valleys or near routes of travel. Their churches were constructed in the Orthodox tradition, with domes and frescoes. Monasteries had walls, cells for monks, and outbuildings for storage. Some monasteries served as fortified refuges, capable of sheltering villagers during raids. The combination of religious and defensive functions made monasteries important landmarks. Religious life in Wallachia was shaped by the Orthodox Church. The majority of the population followed Orthodoxy, with churches in villages and towns providing spiritual structure. Services were conducted in Church Slavonic, the liturgical language of the region. Priests administered sacraments, taught prayers, and maintained rituals. Religion marked the calendar with feasts, fasts, and saints' days. The rhythm of fasting was strict, with abstinence from meat and dairy on numerous days. Village churches were often small wooden structures. Larger towns and monasteries had stone churches, decorated with frescoes depicting biblical scenes and saints. Icons played a central role, serving as focal points of devotion. Candles, often made from beeswax, illuminated interiors. Village organization combined religious and social life. Communities were small, usually composed of extended families. Work was collective during harvest or construction. Elders or village heads mediated disputes. Obligations to lords or boyars included taxes, labour services, and military duties. These obligations were burdensome but necessary for survival within the political order of the principality. Festivals and gatherings broke the monotony of daily work. Religious holidays brought processions, special foods, and visits to churches. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals were communal events binding villages together. Seasonal fairs in towns allowed peasants to sell goods, meet traders, and purchase tools or cloth. Thus, before the birth of Vlad III of Wallachia, Wallachia and Transylvania were regions defined by slow travel, modest architecture, and a religious calendar that shaped community life. Roads were difficult, houses were simple, and churches stood at the centre of villages. Fortresses and monasteries guarded the land, while markets connected peasants to broader trade networks. This was the environment of ordinary life, repetitive and persistent, setting the background for the political events that would follow in later decades. Part 4. Weather, disasters, economy, and conclusion. The land of Wallachia, like much of Eastern Europe in the 15th century, was subject to the effects of weather and natural events. These forces, beyond the control of princes or peasants, shaped the rhythms of daily life and the fortunes of communities. Chronicles, though sparse, occasionally mention years of hardship caused by climate, flood, or disease. Weather was central to survival. A cold winter could destroy livestock if fodder ran short. A wet spring delayed sowing, while a dry summer reduced yields. The balance was fragile. Even small shifts in rainfall or temperature could make the difference between abundance and scarcity. When snow came early, villages had to rely on reserves. When drought lasted, streams dried, crops failed, and animals weakened. Floods along the Danube were common. Each spring, as snow melted in the mountains, the river swelled, overflowing banks and spreading into low-lying areas. Villages built near the river often suffered damage. Wooden houses collapsed, fields were covered in silt, and livestock drowned. Floods also disrupted trade, halting river traffic. Some years were worse than others, with chronicles recording destructive inundations that ruined entire districts. Plagues also struck. Epidemics of disease, often associated with poor harvests or increased movement of armies and traders, spread rapidly through villages and towns. Records from surrounding regions note outbreaks of the plague in the 15th century, which likely reached Wallachia at intervals. Mortality was high, and the social impact was severe. Families lost members, villages lost labourers, and fields went untended. Survivors faced hunger as supplies diminished. Locust swarms were another threat, mentioned in accounts from the Balkans. These swarms could strip fields of crops in days, leaving famine in their wake. While not annual, their occurrence created lasting fear. Villagers looked to religious rituals for protection, with priests leading prayers or processions during such crises. The economy of Wallachia was primarily agrarian. Agriculture provided the foundation, supplemented by livestock raising, beekeeping, and limited trade. Surpluses were modest. Most peasants produced enough for their households and for obligations to their lords. Surpluses for trade were occasional rather than constant. This limited the development of markets, though local fairs and regional exchanges remained important. Taxation was a defining feature of the economy. Princes collected tribute from peasants and nobles alike. Taxes could take several forms. In-kind payments included grain, livestock, wool, honey, or wine. Labour obligations required peasants to work on estates or fortification projects. In some cases, coin was collected, though monetary circulation was limited compared to Western Europe. Silver coins circulated, including Hungarian and Ottoman issues, but barter remained widespread. Princes also had to manage tribute to external powers. Wallachia's rulers, depending on circumstances, paid tribute either to the Kingdom of Hungary or to the Ottoman Empire, and sometimes to both. This tribute strained the local economy, as peasants ultimately bore the burden through heavier taxation. The balance between local needs and foreign demands was fragile. Too much taxation led to unrest. Too little tribute invited invasion. Boyars, the noble class, also collected taxes from peasants on their estates. Their demands varied, but they often required a share of harvests, livestock, or labour. This created a layered system of obligation, with peasants supporting both their immediate lords and the prince above them. Disputes over taxation were frequent sources of conflict between boyars and princes, contributing to instability in governance. Trade supplemented agriculture. Markets in towns facilitated exchange. Transylvanian Saxons traded salt, iron and cloth for Wallachian livestock, hides and grain. The Danube allowed trade with Ottoman markets, bringing spices, fabrics and other goods from Anatolia and the Balkans. Still, the volume of trade was small compared to wealthier regions of Europe. Wallachia remained a frontier society with limited urbanization and a largely subsistence economy. The taxation system and fragile economy meant that life was often precarious. A poor harvest could not easily be offset by imports. Famine, disease and raids could quickly destabilize entire regions. Princes relied on a delicate balance, enough resources to support their rule, but not so much extraction that their subjects revolted or fled. This balance was rarely perfect. In conclusion, the geography, climate, economy and society of Wallachia and Transylvania in the 15th century created a landscape of contrasts. Fertile soil existed, but harvests were uncertain. Forests and rivers provided resources, but also obstacles. Roads connected villages to towns, but slowly and imperfectly. Houses were simple, food was plain, and life was shaped by repetition and necessity. Religion organized the calendar, while fortresses and monasteries offered protection. Natural disasters, famine and disease remained constant threats. This was the land into which Vlad III was born. His story cannot be understood apart from these conditions. The mountains, rivers, villages and fortresses formed the stage upon which politics, warfare and personal ambition unfolded. Before examining the figures who ruled and contested Wallachia, it is necessary to understand that they did so within a fragile environment shaped by natural forces and limited resources. Thus ends the background of geography and daily life. With this setting established, we may proceed, slowly and carefully, to the political conditions of 15th century Eastern Europe. This will form the subject of the next chapter, where we will consider the regional powers, the rivalries of Hungary, the ambitions of the Ottoman Empire, and the position of Wallachia between them. Chapter 2. Political Background of 15th Century Eastern Europe, Part 1. Introduction. The history of Vlad III, later known as Vlad the Impaler, cannot be understood without considering the political setting of his time. The 15th century in Eastern Europe was defined by shifting borders, rival dynasties, and the steady advance of the Ottoman Empire into the Balkans. Wallachia, his homeland, was small, vulnerable, and frequently contested. It lay between larger powers, Hungary to the north and west, the Ottoman Empire to the south, and Moldavia to the northeast. To survive, its rulers balanced tribute, diplomacy, and warfare. This chapter will describe the regional background slowly and carefully, moving from Hungary to the Ottoman Empire, then to Moldavia, before concluding with the fragile balance of power that shaped Wallachia's fate. Part 2. The Kingdom of Hungary in the 15th century was one of the strongest kingdoms of Central Europe. It extended across the Carpathian Basin, bordered by the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, and the Balkans. Its kings commanded substantial armies and held influence over neighbouring territories including Transylvania, Croatia, and Slovakia. The Hungarian crown saw itself as protector of Christendom against the Ottoman advance. From the late 14th century onward, Hungarian kings launched or supported crusading campaigns into the Balkans. They fortified their southern border along the Danube, where fortresses such as Belgrade served as key defences. Hungary's kings relied on noble support as well as alliances with regional rulers. Wallachia, lying just south of the Carpathians, was considered part of Hungary's sphere of influence. During Vlad's lifetime, Hungary was ruled by John Hunyadi and later by his son Matthias Corvinus. Hunyadi was not a king but served as regent, leading armies against the Ottomans in the 1440s and 1450s. He became known for his victories, especially the defence of Belgrade in 1456. His power extended into Transylvania, where he controlled estates and oversaw military campaigns. Wallachian rulers often found themselves dependent on his support or threatened by his armies. Matthias Corvinus succeeded as King of Hungary in 1458. He inherited his father's military position, but also sought to strengthen Hungary internally. He raised a standing army, the Black Army, funded by new taxes. He also engaged in diplomacy with Western Europe while continuing to watch the Ottoman frontier. For Vlad III, Matthias was both an ally and, at times, a rival. His support was essential for Wallachian princes seeking recognition. Part 3. The Ottoman Empire south of the Danube. The Ottoman Empire expanded steadily in the 15th century. Originally based in Anatolia, the Ottomans crossed into Europe in the late 14th century, capturing key territories in the Balkans. By Vlad's time, they controlled Bulgaria, Serbia, and parts of Greece. Their capital at Edirne allowed them to project power into Europe, and after 1453, Constantinople itself became their seat under Mehmed II. The Ottomans were militarily powerful. Their armies included cavalry, infantry, and the janissaries, elite soldiers drawn from Christian populations through the Devshirme system. They combined gunpowder weapons with traditional tactics. Their navy patrolled the Black Sea and the Aegean. For small states like Wallachia, the Ottoman army represented both a threat and a reality they could not ignore. Ottoman policy toward Wallachia was pragmatic. Princes were required to pay tribute, provide hostages, and support Ottoman campaigns. In return, they were often confirmed as rulers so long as they remained loyal. Failure to pay tribute or defiance against the Sultan could result in invasion and replacement. Vlad himself spent years as an Ottoman hostage, part of this system of control. Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, reigned during Vlad's adulthood. His capture of Constantinople in 1453 transformed the empire into a dominant Mediterranean power. He sought to consolidate Ottoman control over the Balkans, including Wallachia. His reign marked the peak of Ottoman pressure on Vlad and his contemporaries. Part 4. The Principality of Moldavia to the northeast of Wallachia lay Moldavia. Like Wallachia, Moldavia was a principality caught between larger powers. It bordered Poland to the north, Hungary to the west, and the Ottoman sphere to the south. Its rulers balanced these influences through diplomacy and tribute. And Moldavia's most famous ruler during this era was Stephen the Great Stefan Selmer, who reigned from 1457 to 1504. Stephen resisted both Hungarian and Ottoman pressure at times, though he too paid tribute when necessary. His reign was long and marked by frequent wars, alliances, and shifting loyalties. Relations between Wallachia and Moldavia were complex. The two states shared cultural and linguistic ties, but often found themselves in rivalry. At other times, they supported one another, particularly when resisting external invasions. Dynastic marriages also linked their ruling families. For Vlad III, Moldavia was both a refuge during exile and a potential ally or adversary, depending on circumstances. Part 5. The regional balance of power. The 15th century in Eastern Europe was therefore a time of contested frontiers. Hungary sought to defend Christendom and maintain influence over Wallachia. The Ottoman Empire advanced northward, demanding tribute and loyalty from small states. Moldavia maneuvered between its stronger neighbours. Poland, the Holy Roman Empire, and Venice also played occasional roles, sending aid or negotiating treaties, though their involvement was less direct. Wallachia lay at the centre of these pressures. Its position was strategic, controlling routes across the Carpathians and along the Danube, yet its resources were limited. Princes of Wallachia survived by shifting alliances. At times they leaned toward Hungary, at other times toward the Ottomans. Rarely could they stand alone. Internal struggles among boyars added to the instability, as rival factions aligned with different foreign powers. This fragile balance created the stage for Vlad the Career. His reigns, conflicts, and policies cannot be separated from this broader environment. Each decision, whether to pay tribute, fight, or negotiate, reflected the realities of Wallachia's position between empires. Part 6. Transition. The political background of 15th century Eastern Europe was thus one of rivalry and shifting loyalties. Hungary stood as a Christian bulwark. The Ottoman Empire pressed steadily forward. Moldavia maneuvered for survival. Wallachia, small and exposed, was caught in the middle. With this context in mind, we can now move more directly into the story of Vlad's family, beginning with his father, Vlad Dracula, and the Order of the Dragon. Their lives and struggles illustrate how Wallachia's princes navigated this dangerous frontier. This will form the subject of the next chapter. Part 2. Expanded. Hungary's taxation and administration. The Kingdom of Hungary in the 15th century functioned through a layered system of taxation and governance. Its kings drew authority from feudal obligations, but also introduced financial measures to sustain continuous military readiness against the Ottomans. The southern frontier, where Wallachia bordered Hungary's interests, absorbed much of these resources. Taxation in Hungary was collected in several forms. One common levy was the chamber's profit, lucrum camera, originally a fee for exchanging coins whenever the crown altered currency. By the 15th century, this had transformed into a general tax on households. There were also extraordinary war taxes, requested when the crown needed funds for campaigns. Such taxes could be levied at 1 florin per household, a heavy burden that required noble consent in the Diet. For peasants, obligations included labour services, produced deliveries, and coin payments. The nobility enjoyed exemptions from many forms of taxation, but were required to provide military service. In practice, this service often shifted into cash contributions or the maintenance of retinues. Hungarian kings had to negotiate continually with the nobility to secure funds. The frontier defence required special arrangements. Castles and fortresses were supplied through revenues from nearby estates. Lords of these borderlands maintained garrisons, sometimes supplemented by mercenaries. John Hunyadi, who rose from the lesser nobility, expanded these systems by recruiting troops directly and levying taxes for military use. His position as governor of Hungary in the mid-15th century allowed him to concentrate resources against the Ottomans. This system meant that Wallachia's princes, when aligned with Hungary, were tied into a larger fiscal and military network. They might be expected to contribute troops, supply provisions, or provide intelligence. In return, they received Hungarian backing in internal disputes. The financial dimension of Hungary's power thus reached into Wallachia indirectly through tribute and obligations linked to the defence of Christendom. Part 3. Expanded. Ottoman administration. In the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire employed a different system of governance in the Balkans. Conquered lands were organised into provinces or sanjaks, each governed by a sanjakbi. Above them stood larger provinces called eyalıts, administered by a beylerbey. By the mid-15th century, much of the Balkans, including Serbia, Bulgaria and Thrace, was structured under this hierarchy. The Ottoman administrative system relied on the Timur system. Land was granted to cavalry officers, sipahis, in exchange for military service. These officers collected taxes from peasants who continued farming as before, but now under Ottoman authority. Taxes included grain, livestock and coin, while occasional levies supported construction or provisioning. The system ensured both revenue and readiness, as sipahis were obliged to provide mounted troops during campaigns. The Ottomans also levied tribute from Christian principalities that were not directly conquered, such as Wallachia and Moldavia. This tribute was negotiated periodically and often included coin, livestock and goods. In addition, princes were required to send hostages, usually sons or close relatives, to ensure loyalty. Vlad III himself was one such hostage held at the Ottoman court in the 1440s. The administration extended to religion as well. The Ottomans allowed Orthodox Christianity to continue but placed it under the supervision of the Patriarch in Constantinople, who now operated under Ottoman oversight after 1453. Monasteries and churches paid taxes, though some enjoyed exemptions through charters granted by sultans, pans. This pragmatic tolerance helped stabilize conquered regions, though heavy taxation sometimes led to discontent. Trade routes were integrated into the empire. Goods from Anatolia flowed into the Balkans, while Balkan resources such as grain, livestock and slaves were exported southward. Customs duties provided revenue. Ottoman garrisons ensured security along these routes, though they also enforced control. For Wallachia, proximity to these structures meant constant pressure. Resistance risked invasion, while submission meant regular tribute. Part 4. Expanded. Moldavian alliances and diplomacy. Moldavia's political stance in the 15th century was shaped by its geography. Located between Poland, Hungary and the Ottoman frontier, Moldavia acted cautiously, shifting alliances to preserve autonomy. Tribute payments were common, but so were military campaigns asserting independence. The reign of Stephen the Great, beginning in 1457, illustrates these patterns. Stephen sometimes allied with Poland, at other times with Hungary, and occasionally with the Ottomans. His long reign demonstrates the skill required to survive in a contested region. Victories against invading forces gave him prestige, but even he could not avoid paying tribute when circumstances demanded. Moldavian rulers also relied on marriage alliances. Dynastic unions connected them to Polish, Hungarian, and Wallachian families. These ties provided temporary security but also drew Moldavia into external disputes. When conflicts broke out between Hungary and the Ottomans, Moldavia often became involved, willingly or not. For Wallachia, Moldavia represented both opportunity and risk. At times, the two principalities supported one another, sharing cultural and religious ties as orthodox states. At other times, rival claimants to their thrones found refuge across the border, making relations tense. Vlad III himself spent periods in Moldavia during exile, demonstrating the shifting role of the principality in Wallachian politics. Part 5 expanded the role of Venice and Poland beyond Hungary, the Ottomans and Moldavia. Other powers also shaped the region indirectly. The Republic of Venice, though primarily a maritime power, held interests in the Balkans and along the Adriatic. Venetian merchants traded extensively in the region, purchasing grain, wax, and slaves. Venice also clashed with the Ottomans over control of ports and islands. Campaigns in the Aegean and Dalmatian coasts occasionally intersected with Balkan politics, drawing Wallachian rulers into broader struggles. Poland, to the north, maintained suzerainty over Moldavia at times. Polish kings saw themselves as protectors of their southern neighbour, though practical support was inconsistent. Polish involvement in Wallachian affairs was less direct, but still present, particularly when rival factions sought foreign recognition. The Polish crown occasionally mediated disputes or supported candidates aligned with its interests. The Holy Roman Empire and the papacy also played roles. Calls for crusade against the Ottomans were frequent, though often poorly funded. Envoys travelled between courts, promising aid that seldom arrived in time. Nevertheless, these appeals influenced Wallachian princes who balanced their commitments between Christendom and the Ottoman Sultan. Part 6. Conclusion to Chapter 2. The political background of 15th century Eastern Europe was therefore intricate. Hungary administered its realm through taxation and noble support, directing resources to its southern frontier. The Ottoman Empire organised its provinces with efficiency, demanding tribute and loyalty from neighbouring principalities. Moldavia manoeuvred carefully between stronger powers, while Venice, Poland, and other states played supporting roles. Wallachia's position within this environment was precarious. Surrounded by competing influences, its rulers had to act with caution and adaptability. The survival of a prince depended less on internal strength than on the ability to secure recognition from one or more external powers. Tribute payments, military campaigns, and dynastic marriages all formed part of this delicate balance. This was the stage upon which Vlad Dracula III would act. His personal story cannot be detached from these wider forces. The rivalries of Hungary and the Ottomans, the diplomacy of Moldavia, and the interventions of Venice and Poland all shaped his reigns and his choices. With this context established, the narrative may now turn to Vlad's family origins, beginning with his father, Vlad II Dracula, and the influence of the Order of the Dragon. Their history connects the regional background with the personal trajectory of Vlad the Impaler. Chapter 3. The Family of Vlad II Dracula and the Order of the Dragon Part 1. Introduction. To understand Vlad III, it is necessary to examine his family origins. The princes of Wallachia were not absolute monarchs, but part of a fragile dynastic system where succession was contested and legitimacy was never guaranteed. The house into which Vlad was born was tied to both the local boyar elite and to foreign influences, particularly Hungary. His father, Vlad II Dracula, played a central role in establishing these connections. This chapter will describe the family background slowly and carefully. It will begin with the genealogy of Wallachia's ruling house, then move to the life of Vlad II Dracula, his membership in the Order of the Dragon, and his reign as Prince of Wallachia. The instability of Wallachian politics, the role of boyars, and the influence of foreign powers will also be considered. Part 2. The Basarab dynasty, the ruling family of Wallachia, in the 15th century descended from the Basarab dynasty, founded in the early 14th century. Basarab I, who reigned from 1310 to 1352, established Wallachia's independence from Hungarian control. His victory at the Battle of Posada in 1330 ensured recognition of Wallachia as a principality. From then on, the Basarab line divided into branches, often competing for the throne. By the 15th century, succession disputes were common. Wallachian princes were chosen by the boyars, the high-ranking nobles, who balanced loyalty and self-interest. Rival claimants, often cousins, contested the throne with external backing. This instability created an environment where few rulers held power for long. Reigns could last for years, months, or even weeks, depending on circumstances. Vlad III of Dracula was part of the Draculisty branch of the Basarabs. His line traced back to Mircea the Elder, who ruled Wallachia from 1386 to 1418. Mircea strengthened the principality, fought against the Ottomans, and maintained relations with Hungary. His descendants, however, faced increasing pressure as the Ottomans advanced and Hungarian influence persisted. Part 3. Vlad II Dracula Vlad II, later known as A Dracula, was born around 1390. He spent much of his early life in the shadow of Hungarian politics. His path to the throne of Wallachia was shaped by service to Hungary's King Sigismund of Luxembourg, who reigned from 1387 to 1437 and also became Holy Roman Emperor. In 1431, Vlad was admitted to the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order founded by Sigismund in 1408. The order was dedicated to defending Christianity against the Ottomans and other perceived enemies. Members swore loyalty to the king and pledged to uphold the cross. The emblem of the order was a dragon, often depicted with its tail coiled around its neck. Vlad's later epithet, a Dracul, derived from this membership, meaning other dragon. His son Vlad III would be known as a Dracula, or a son of the dragon. A Vlad II admission into the order reflected his status as an important regional figure. It also connected him to broader European networks of power. Yet membership did not guarantee security. The order was symbolic, but Wallachia remained vulnerable to the immediate threats of Ottoman raids and Hungarian ambitions. Part 4. Vlad II, reign in Wallachia. Vlad II first became Prince of Wallachia in 1436. His reign was characterized by the delicate balance between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Both powers sought influence over Wallachia, and both demanded tribute or loyalty. Vlad attempted to navigate between them. At times, he aligned with Hungary, supporting campaigns against the Ottomans. At other times, he paid tribute to the Ottomans to avoid invasion. This dual policy was common among Wallachian rulers but carried risks. Hungary regarded tribute to the Ottomans as disloyalty, while the Ottomans punished lapses in payment with military pressure. Domestically, Vlad too faced opposition from boyar factions. Some nobles favoured alignment with Hungary, while others preferred the Ottomans. Their shifting loyalties weakened princely authority. Vlad's position depended on maintaining support among these elites, while also satisfying foreign overlords. The 1440s were particularly unstable. In 1442, Vlad was briefly removed from power, but restored with Ottoman assistance. In 1443-1444, the Christian crusade, led by John Hunyadi against the Ottomans, created further challenges. Vlad tried to maintain neutrality, but suspicion from both sides increased. His divided loyalties ultimately contributed to his downfall. Part 5. The fall of Vlad II Dracul in 1447. Vlad II Dracul was killed, likely on the orders of John Hunyadi, who considered him unreliable. His elder son, Mircea, was also executed. Their deaths marked a turning point in Wallachian politics. The throne passed to rivals supported by Hungary, while Vlad's younger sons, Vlad III and Radu, were left in uncertain positions. Vlad III had already spent years as a hostage at the Ottoman court, while his brother Radu remained there longer. These experiences shaped their later paths. Radu became aligned with the Ottomans, while Vlad developed a reputation for resistance. The death of their father and brother created both trauma and opportunity as the surviving sons sought to reclaim their inheritance. Part 6. The Order of the Dragon and its symbolism. The Order of the Dragon deserves additional attention as it influenced the symbolism associated with Vlad's family. The order was not unique to Vlad II, but included many noblemen across Central and Eastern Europe. Its founding purpose was to rally Christian leaders against the Ottoman threat. Members wore the dragon emblem and pledged defence of the faith. For Vlad II, membership enhanced prestige. It marked him as a loyal servant of the Hungarian crown and as a defender of Christianity. Yet the practical effects were limited. When confronted with Ottoman power, symbolic oaths could not prevent political compromise. Nevertheless, the dragon emblem left a lasting mark. His name, Dracula, derived directly from this order, and through his son, the name would echo into legend. The dragon itself, as a symbol, carried multiple meanings. In Christian tradition, it was often associated with evil or Satan, yet in the context of the order, it represented strength, vigilance, and protection of the faith. This ambiguity may have later influenced European interpretations of Vlad III when stories of his cruelty spread. The dragon became linked, not with chivalric defence, but with fearsome destruction. Part 7. Conclusion to Chapter 3. The family background of Vlad III was thus deeply entwined with the politics of 15th-century Eastern Europe. The Basarab dynasty provided legitimacy, but succession was unstable. Vlad II Dracula sought to balance Hungary and the Ottomans, yet his divided loyalties led to his downfall. His membership in the Order of the Dragon gave him prestige, but also the epithet that would pass to his son. The deaths of Vlad II and his eldest son left a legacy of conflict. The surviving sons, Vlad III and Radu, inherited not stability but struggle. Their futures would be shaped by foreign courts, shifting alliances, and the violent contests for the Wallachian throne. This concludes the examination of Vlad the family origins. In the next chapter, attention will turn to Vlad III's own early life, including his time as a hostage in the Ottoman court. This period was formative, shaping his outlook, his methods of rule, and his enduring reputation. Chapter 4. Childhood of Vlad III and his hostageship in the Ottoman court. Part 1. Introduction. The childhood of Vlad III cannot be understood in isolation. It was shaped by the unstable politics of Wallachia, the ambitions of Hungary, and above all, the rising power of the Ottoman Empire. As the son of Vlad II Dracula, Vlad inherited both noble blood and heavy burdens. His early years were divided between his father's court in Wallachia and, later, the palaces of the Ottoman sultans. This chapter will explore his upbringing in stages. It will begin with the environment of his childhood in Wallachia, then move to the circumstances that led to his being sent as a hostage to the Ottomans. From there, it will examine his daily life, his education, and his relationship with his younger brother, Radu. These formative experiences laid the foundation for his later personality, his ambitions, and his reputation. Part 2. Early years in Wallachia. Vlad III was born in either 1431 or 1432, most likely in the fortress town of Caesarea, located in Transylvania, which was then under Hungarian control. His father, Vlad II Dracula, governed the region temporarily before ascending to the Wallachian throne. Caesarea was a Saxon town, populated by German-speaking settlers, merchants, and craftsmen. Growing up in this environment exposed young Vlad to multiple languages, cultures, and religions. The household of Vlad II was neither large nor secure. Unlike the royal courts of Western Europe, Wallachia's princely court lacked grandeur. It was practical, focused on survival. Food was simple, clothing was functional, and housing was fortified rather than lavish. Even as a child, Vlad would have been surrounded by the sense of constant threat from rival boyars, from Hungarian interference, and from Ottoman pressure. Stories from his early years suggest a child observant of conflict. He grew up hearing of battles, betrayals, and shifting alliances. He witnessed the tensions between nobles, and he saw how his father's authority was never absolute. These impressions prepared him for a lifetime of suspicion and vigilance. Part 3. Circumstances of hostageship. By 1442, the situation in Wallachia had grown dire. The Ottomans demanded loyalty and tribute, while Hungary pressed for allegiance to Christian campaigns. Vlad II Dracula, attempting to balance these forces, agreed to send his two younger sons, Vlad III and Radu, as hostages to the Ottoman court. This arrangement was common practice. The Ottomans used hostages not only as guarantees of loyalty, but also as opportunities to shape the next generation of rulers. By raising the sons of vassals in their court, they could instill obedience, familiarity with Ottoman customs, and a sense of dependence. For Vlad III, though, this was a decisive moment. Torn from his homeland, from familiar landscapes, from the rhythms of Wallachian life, he entered a new world of discipline, hierarchy, and luxury unlike anything he had known before. His brother, Radu, accompanied him, but their experiences and reactions would diverge sharply in the years to come. Part 4. Arrival at the Ottoman court. The Ottoman court of the mid-15th century was a place of great power and splendour. At its centre stood Sultan Murad II, who reigned from 1421 to 1451. The Sultan's palace was not merely a residence but the nerve centre of a vast empire. It was filled with administrators, soldiers, scholars and servants. For young hostages like Vlad and Radu, arrival at the court was overwhelming. The court's overwhelming. They would have encountered marble halls, intricate mosaics, fine textiles, and disciplined guards. They were placed under the supervision of tutors and officials who ensured that their lives followed strict routines. The Ottomans did not treat hostages as prisoners in chains, but neither were they free. Their lives were carefully controlled. They were educated, fed, and clothed, but always reminded that their status depended on their father's loyalty. If Vlad II betrayed the Sultan, his sons' lives would be at risk. Part 5. Education of Vlad III. The education provided to Vlad in the Ottoman court was comprehensive. It included language training, military skills, and exposure to Islamic culture. Languages. Vlad would have learned Turkish alongside Greek and perhaps Arabic. This allowed him to communicate with Ottoman officials and understand the empire's workings. Military training. Boys of noble birth were trained in horsemanship, archery, and the use of weapons. The Ottomans prized discipline and precision, qualities instilled from an early age. Intellectual instruction. Tutors introduced subjects such as history, religion, and administration. Though Christian by birth, Vlad would have been required to attend lessons in the Quran and Islamic law, giving him insights into a worldview different from his own. This education was meant to shape obedient allies. Yet for Vlad, it seems to have produced resentment. While he absorbed the training, he resisted the cultural assimilation. His younger brother, Radu, proved more receptive, but Vlad's character inclined him toward defiance. Part 6. Daily life in the palace. Daily life for Vlad and Radu followed a strict schedule. They rose early, attended lessons, practiced military drills, and ate meals according to court regulations. Food was richer than in Wallachia, featuring rice, lamb, spices, and fruits unfamiliar to them. Clothing was elegant, with fine fabrics, though still controlled by court rules. Religious life formed part of their daily rhythm. Islamic prayers structured the day, and although the boys remained Christian, they lived within an environment dominated by Islamic practice. This could not have failed to leave an impression. The palace was both protective and confining. The boys had access to gardens, libraries, and training grounds, but always under supervision. Every glance from a guard, every command from a tutor, reminded them of their dependent status. Part 7. The relationship between Vlad and Radu the brothers responded differently to their circumstances. For instances, Radu, younger and more adaptable, grew attached to Ottoman culture. He admired the refinement of the court and developed loyalty to Sultan Murad and later to his successor, Maindoi Vaize's Buswan him favour, earning him the epithet of Radu the Handsome. Vlad, in contrast, resisted. Accounts describe him as proud, stubborn, and defiant. He tolerated the education but never embraced it. His sense of being a hostage, of being controlled, deepened his mistrust. He learned discipline, but not submission. The difference between the brothers widened over time. Radu became a willing ally of the Ottomans, while Vlad grew into their fiercest adversary. Yet in childhood, they remained bound together by blood and circumstance. Two sons of Wallachia, caught in the machinery of empire, shaped in opposite directions by the same environment. Part 8. Conclusion to Chapter 4. The childhood of Vlad III divided between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire. Born into instability, he was taken as a hostage, educated in foreign ways, and trained in both military and intellectual disciplines. His daily life at the Ottoman court was ordered and disciplined, yet for him it was a prison as much as a school. The contrast with his brother Radu foreshadowed future divisions. Where Radu embraced Ottoman favour, Vlad resisted, cultivating a sense of independence that later manifested in harsh methods and implacable hostility toward Ottoman power. These formative years prepared Vlad not only for leadership but also for conflict. His worldview was shaped by distrust, vigilance, and the memory of captivity. In the next chapter, attention will turn to Vlad's return to Wallachia and the struggles that followed as he attempted to claim his father's throne in a world of shifting alliances and relentless dangers. Part 1. Food, clothing, and rituals at the Ottoman court. The Ottoman palace was a structured environment. Its daily routines were carefully ordered, and those living within it followed patterns that reinforced hierarchy and discipline. For Vlad III and his brother Radu, who had grown up in the simpler conditions of Wallachia and Transylvania, this represented a profound change. Food was one of the most visible differences. In Wallachia, meals had been plain: coarse bread baked in clay ovens, porridge made of millet or barley, small amounts of cheese, and occasional meat, often pork. In the Ottoman court, meals were richer, more varied, and strongly flavoured with spices that came from long trade routes. Rice pilafs, lamb stews, roasted poultry, chickpeas and lentils formed staples. Olive oil, which was rare in Wallachia, was commonly used. Sweet pastries filled with honey and nuts were prepared for special occasions. Dates, figs and pomegranates, fruits unfamiliar to Wallachian peasants, appeared on the table. Coffee, though not yet a central beverage, was beginning to circulate in elite spaces. Meals followed ritualised patterns. They were taken sitting on carpets, with dishes placed on low tables or trays. Diners ate with their hands, using bread to scoop portions or with wooden spoons. Washing before and after eating was mandatory, reflecting both hygiene and religious practice. For Vlad, such customs were foreign, requiring adaptation. Clothing also marked the contrast. In Wallachia, garments were made of wool, hemp or linen, dyed with natural colours and cut for practicality. At the Ottoman court, garments were elaborate. Robes of silk or finely woven cotton were common. Colours carried symbolic meanings, and certain shades or fabrics were reserved for high-ranking individuals. Belts, turbans, and embroidered slippers completed the attire. For young hostages, clothing was provided according to status. They did not wear rags, nor did they dress as princes of equal standing with Ottoman nobility. Their attire reminded them of their in-between position. Respected, but not free. Rituals of the day were also striking. The palace followed the rhythm of Islamic prayer, with the call to prayer sounding 5 times daily. Even if Christian hostages were not compelled to join in worship, they lived within the soundscape and schedule of Islam. Feasts, fasts, and ceremonies marked the calendar. Ramadan brought a different rhythm, with fasting by day and meals after sunset. Eid celebrations filled the palace with processions, music, and gift-giving. To a boy raised in the Christian traditions of Wallachia, these rituals would have appeared both fascinating and alien. This environment did not simply feed and clothe the boys. It reshaped their sense of time, order, and belonging. Part 2. The psychological effect of hostageship. Hostageship carried with it an ever-present psychological burden. Though treated with courtesy, Vlad and Radu were never free. They knew that their lives were guarantees for their father's loyalty. This awareness shaped their thoughts and behaviours from childhood. The fear of punishment was constant. If Vlad II, Dracula, their father, wavered in tribute or allegiance, the boys risked imprisonment, mutilation, or death. Such measures were not theoretical. Other hostages, both from the Balkans and from Anatolia, had suffered brutal fates when their families betrayed the Ottomans. These examples were deliberately made visible. The message was clear. Obedience meant survival. Disobedience meant destruction. The sense of displacement was equally profound. Removed from their homeland, language, and familiar surroundings, Vlad and Radu lived in a world of different customs, beliefs, and expectations. They were not prisoners in chains, but they were not guests either. Their every move was observed, their education controlled, their futures uncertain. Psychologically, this could produce two responses, submission or resistance. Radu leaned towards submission. He found comfort in adapting, in pleasing his tutors, and in aligning himself with the court's expectations. Vlad, however, inclined toward resistance. He internalized discipline but held on to resentment. He learned skills but refused to yield his inner loyalty. This divergence began to shape their characters. The same palace walls that enclosed them produced opposite reactions, obedience in one, defiance in the other. Part 3. Anecdotes of punishments, discipline, and fear. The Ottoman court was not only a place of refinement, but also of strict discipline. Stories recorded in later chronicles, though coloured by bias, suggest the kinds of punishments and lessons that young hostages might have witnessed. Minor offences, lateness, disobedience, or disrespect, were met with physical correction. Beatings with sticks were common. Severe breaches of conduct, such as attempted escape or defiance, could result in harsher outcomes: confinement in dark chambers, starvation rations, or public humiliation. Hostages lived with the knowledge that their safety was conditional. When their fathers complied with tribute, they enjoyed security. When doubt arose, threats appeared. There are accounts of hostages being displayed in chains before messengers as a warning of what might happen should a vassal prince betray the Sultan. For Vlad, these lessons were formative. He saw that power rested on fear, discipline, and visibility. The Ottomans maintained control not merely through force, but through ritualized displays of authority. This observation may later have influenced his own methods of rule, where punishment was not only retribution, but spectacle. The fear of sudden retribution hung over everyday foe. A rumour of rebellion in Wallachia, a delay in tribute, or a shift in alliance could instantly place the boys in danger. They learned to mask their emotions, to obey outwardly, and to endure silently. Such habits shaped their future temperaments. Radu toward pliancy, Vlad toward a cold, calculating vigilance. Part 4. The growing rivalry between Vlad and Radu living side by side in the Ottoman court. Vlad and Radu shared the same routines, but diverged in their responses. This divergence created rivalry, sharpened by comparisons drawn by their tutors and overseers. Radu was praised for his beauty, charm, and adaptability. He learned Turkish quickly, embraced court manners, and showed willingness to serve the Sultan. He gained the nickname Radu Sel Frumos, or Radu the Handsome. Favour followed him. He became a symbol of what the Ottomans hoped for. A pliant future ruler who would keep Wallachia loyal. Vlad, by contrast, was known for severity, pride, and resistance. He obeyed commands, but without warmth. He absorbed lessons, but did not seek favour. This made him less popular with his tutors, yet it also set him apart. He was seen as unbending, a boy who would not yield. The rivalry between brothers was not only personal, but political. The Ottomans viewed Radu as a potential ally, Vlad as a potential obstacle. This dynamic foreshadowed future conflict. When they later contended for the throne of Wallachia, their opposing paths, submission versus defiance, would collide directly. Within the palace walls, the rivalry may have been expressed in small ways: differences in treatment, words of praise or rebuke, or competitions in military training. Over time, these differences became defining traits. Part 5. Conclusion to Chapter 4. Expansion. The childhood of Vlad III, partly in Wallachia and partly as a hostage in the Ottoman court, shaped his character in enduring ways. The food, clothing, and rituals of the palace exposed him to a new culture, yet he resisted assimilation. The psychological effect of hostageship deepened his distrust of others and his reliance on discipline. The punishments and fear that surrounded him taught him that power was inseparable from authority made visible. The rivalry with his brother Radu, born in the same environment, produced a lasting division that would define Wallachian politics for decades. These years were not merely an interlude in Vlad's life. They were formative, teaching him lessons about survival, loyalty, fear, and control. When he later returned to Wallachia, he carried with him not only memories of captivity, but also the methods and observations of the Ottoman court, adapted, hardened, and turned against his former masters. With this background, the story moves toward the next stage: Vlad's contested attempts to claim the throne of Wallachia. Chapter 5. Boyar Politics and Noble Families in 15th Century Wallachia. Part 1. The role of boyars in Wallachian society in the 15th century. Wallachia was not a centralized kingdom in the modern sense. Authority was fragile, and the ruling prince, known as the voivode, did not command unquestioned loyalty. Instead, power was shared, resisted, and often undermined by the boyars, the noble landholding class. The boyars were not a single unified group. They consisted of extended families, each with its own estates, allies, and ambitions. Their loyalty to the voivode was conditional. They swore allegiance, but this allegiance could be withdrawn at any time if their interests were threatened. In practice, this meant that a prince ruled only as long as he maintained the support, or at least the fear, of the boyars. The boyars' position was not merely political, but also social. They were the landlords over much of Wallachia's peasantry. They collected dues, demanded labour, and maintained private retinues of soldiers. They also served in the Svat Domnesk, or princely council, which advised the ruler and had influence over his decisions. In reality, this council often acted as a brake on princely power, ensuring that the prince could not govern alone. Part 2. Land ownership and sources of wealth. The boyars derived their strength from their estates. These estates varied in size but often included fertile farmlands, pastures, vineyards and forests. Agriculture provided grain, especially wheat, rye and barley, which fed both local populations and trade networks. Pastoralism supplied livestock, sheep, cattle and horses, which were essential for both diet and military needs. Forests gave timber, honey and wax, all valuable commodities in local and foreign markets. Salt trade, though more prominent in Transylvania, also enriched some boyars who controlled routes. Wealth meant independence. A boyar with large estates and a strong retinue could resist princely demands. Some could even play rival foreign powers against one another, offering support to Hungary or the Ottomans in exchange for privileges. This land-based wealth created a political geography of power. Certain valleys, river crossings, or towns became centres of boyar dominance. The prince, even if seated in the capital at Targovist, could not ignore these localised powers. Part 3. Major rival clans. The dynasty among the most significant noble families in 15th-century Wallachia were the dynasty rivals of the Draculesti branch to which Vlad III belonged. Both descended from earlier rulers of Wallachia, tracing their lineage to Prince Basarab, the founder of the principality in the 14th century. The dynasty line often challenged the Draculesti line for the throne. Their claims were supported by certain boyar factions and sometimes by Hungary. This rivalry produced cycles of deposition and restoration in which princes from one branch replaced princes from the other. The presence of such rival families meant that succession was never secure. When a voivode died or was deposed, boyars could choose to back a dynasty claimant or a Draculesti one. The throne thus became less a hereditary seat and more a prize contested through alliances, bribes, and armed support. For Vlad III, this rivalry was personal as well as political. The dynasty were among the boyar factions that opposed him, and their claims threatened his legitimacy. The struggle between these branches would frame much of his reign. Part 4. Ties to Hungary and the Ottomans. Wallachia's position between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire gave the boyars opportunities to seek support from abroad. This external dimension made internal politics even more unstable. Hungary. The Hungarian crown, particularly under leaders like John Hunyadi, sought to maintain influence over Wallachia as a buffer against Ottoman expansion. Boyars sympathetic to Hungary received privileges, military backing, and sometimes safe refuge in Transylvanian towns such as Brasov or Sibiu. The Ottomans, the sultans, demanded tribute and loyalty. Boyars who favoured Ottoman alignment could secure protection and trade opportunities. They also gained leverage against rivals by threatening to invite Ottoman intervention. These dual allegiances meant that boyar factions often split. Some supported pro-Hungarian candidates for the throne, others backed pro-Ottoman ones. The result was a constant cycle of shifting loyalties. Princes rose and fell not only by domestic intrigues but also by the decisions of external powers. For the boyars, this balancing act brought short-term gains. For Wallachia as a whole, it produced chronic instability. Part 5. The role of boyars in dethroning and enthroning princes in Wallachia. The voivode was elected in theory, though hereditary succession gave strong claims. The boyars' approval, however, was essential. Without their support, no prince could long remain on the throne. Boyars often plotted together to remove rulers they disliked. Assassinations, betrayals, and defections were common. When dissatisfied with one prince, they could conspire to invite another claimant, often from the rival dynasty or Draculesty branches, with foreign backing, Hungarian troops or Ottoman envoys. Such replacements became swift and decisive. This pattern repeated throughout the 15th century. Princes rose and fell in rapid succession, sometimes ruling only months before being overthrown. This instability eroded the authority of the voivode and increased the influence of boyar families. When Vlad III later turned his wrath against the boyars, executing them, impaling them, or forcing them into labour, it was not merely cruelty. It was his attempt to break this cycle, to destroy the power of those who had made the throne unstable for generations. Part 6. Conclusion to Chapter 5. The boyars of Wallachia were both the foundation and the weakness of the principality. Their land ownership, wealth, and noble lineage gave them independence. Their rivalries, especially between factions like the dynasty and the Draculesty, fractured political life. Their ties to Hungary and the Ottomans made them instruments of foreign influence. Their power to enthrone and dethrone princes created instability that no ruler could ignore. For Vlad III, the boyars represented both an obstacle and an enemy. His first reign would be short-lived, in part because of their opposition. His later policies of terror were shaped by his determination to break their hold. As we move into the next chapter, Vlad's brief first reign in 1448, we will see how these boyar factions, alongside foreign interventions, determined the course of his early career. Chapter 6. Vlad's first reign and interruptions, 1448-1456. Part 1. Opening the scene. Aftermath of 1447, the year 1447 closed one chapter of Wallachian politics and opened another. In that year, the central figure who had held the princely title, Vlad II Dracula, was killed during an intervention by John Hunyadi. Along with him, his eldest son Mircea was removed. The removal of father and eldest son left the pathway to the voivodate contested. A new claimant, Vladislav, sometimes called Vladislav II, was placed on the throne with external support. Uncertain loyalties and the ambitions of local boyars produced a fragile political arrangement in the principality. The death of Vlad II and Mircea created a vacancy that several families and foreign patrons sought to fill, and that vacancy set the conditions for the next years of intrusion, counter-intrusion, and short-lived reigns. Wikipedia, this change in leadership was not a single event, but a sequence of small steps. Messengers passed through mountain passes, noble houses debated in court meetings, envoys carried letters between Transylvanian towns and the Danube frontier. The boyars met to assess their positions. Merchants adjusted their routes. Peasants continued their work under new demands. The political turnover worked itself out slowly and repetitively as one faction rose and another receded. The removal of the previous prince did not instantly create clarity. It created a longer period of shifting claims and opportunities for rivals. Part 2. The opportunity of 1448. Hunyadi's campaign and Vlad's move in 1448. John Hunyadi organised a military campaign against the Ottoman frontier. Campaign seasons in this region tended to cluster in the warmer months. Armies marched in late summer and early autumn, sieges were attempted before the rains, and supply lines were timed to the harvest. The presence of a Hungarian army beyond the Carpathians had the practical effect of drawing attention and resources away from internal affairs in Wallachia. For some claimants, the temporary absence of an opposing leader offered an opening. Vlad, who had already been a figure of potential claim as a surviving son of Vlad II Dracula, moved at such a moment. He entered Wallachia in early October with Ottoman backing. The dynamic was not uncommon in the borderlands. One foreign patron's attention to military matters could be an opening for another patron's client to seize power. Vlad's incursion in 1448 was thus a calculated move, exploiting the temporary distraction caused by a large Hungarian expedition. The Ottoman capture and fortification of Giurgiu on the Danube during this period reinforced Ottoman presence on the frontier and aided Vlad's temporary position. Wikipedia, the months that followed were a repetition of frontier politics. Armies moved along river corridors, fortresses were provisioned, scouts travelled ahead of columned troops, and local boyars chose sides in small piecemeal fashion. Some boyars welcomed the change, others withheld support. support. The episode in 1448 demonstrates how rapidly fortunes could rise when external forces reshaped the local balance. 1 week, a claimant was a guest at a noble's table. A month later, he might be proclaimed voivode. In another month, he might be compelled to flee. Part 3. The shortness of rule. Retreat and flight by winter. The sequence of events in the autumn of 1448 compressed quickly. The Hungarian force suffered a major setback at the Battle of Kosovo in mid-October. The defeat of Hunyadi's army altered the dynamics on both banks of the Danube and removed immediate Hungarian pressure from Wallachian claimants who relied on Hungarian backing. At the same time, the ebb and flow of armies, the fortifications at river crossings, and the loyalties of local lords created a tenuous equilibrium. Vlad's initial advance, aided by Ottoman presence, had to contend with the return of Vladislav II and the shifting loyalties of the boyars and military commanders. The local military resources and retinues that a prince might call upon were limited. When the balance of external power shifted, so too did local support. Wikipedia by early December 1448, the situation had reversed. Vladislav II, returning with surviving forces and with the advantage of local alliances, reasserted himself. Vlad, finding himself without sufficient internal backing and facing the restored claimant, withdrew and sought refuge beyond Wallachhia's borders. By 7 December 1448, Vlad had fled, taking with him the experience of a brief seizure and the lesson that a throne secured by foreign troops alone could not be held without the durable backing of local boyars and fortified positions. Wikipedia, the rhythm here is notable. Seize during opportunity, hold while patrons and fortunes favour you, and withdraw when the patron's power wanes or local loyalties shift. These were repeated patterns in Wallachian political life, and Vlad's first short rule fits this recurring sequence. Part 4. Exile and movement. Ottoman lands, Moldavia, and Hungary after retreat. Vlad's path led him outward again. He did not vanish but relocated, as many dispossessed princes did, between neighbouring courts and realms that might offer sanctuary or renewed support. The first refuge was often the Ottoman sphere, since his earlier contact with Ottoman power had created both enmity and potential shelter. From the Ottoman frontier, he moved in the subsequent months and years to Moldavia, to Hungary, seeking alliances, patrons, and the means to return. The period from late 1448 through the early 1450s was one of travel, negotiation, and patient waiting. In Moldavia, he found a principality that had its own concerns and its own delicate balance with Poland and the Ottomans. In Hungary, he encountered factions with their own rivalries. The pace of life for an exiled claimant was slow. Letters exchanged, envoys dispatched, small assemblies held in private chambers, hospitality extended by local lords, all of it unfolded in repetitive cycles of petition and promise. Contemporary chronicles and later summaries indicate that Vlad spent time in these neighbouring courts during the early 1450s, regrouping and awaiting an opening to press his claim again. Wikipedia +1, there is a prosaic aspect to exile that is often overlooked in dramatic retellings. It involved provision, securing food, horses and money, arranging lodgings, paying retainers, and satisfying the practical needs of a retinue. Host courts expected gifts and favours. The claimant's day-to-day life involved slow negotiation, letters carried on horseback across passes, and the steady accretion of small promises that might one day amount to military aid. The remoteness of mountain passes in winter, the unreliability of supply lines in spring, and the need to time an invasion to the harvest season were routine considerations that stretched out the months and years between attempts at restoration. Part 5. Shifting alliances. The broader political texture before 1456, during the early to mid-1450s, the political landscape continued to shift. Hungary's internal politics evolved. John Hunyadi's campaigns, and later his death, altered the calculus for local allies. The Ottomans consolidated gains in the Balkans and continued to demand tribute and hostages from client princes. Moldavia manoeuvred under Stephen and other rulers. For a claimant like Vlad, each change, each death, each new regent, each treaty represented a potential opening or a closing of doors. The boyars remained central. In exile, a claimant's ability to regain the throne depended on persuading enough powerful men at home or to bring to the field enough cavalry and infantry financed by foreign patrons that the balance could be tipped. This required not only external troops but, as earlier chapters have emphasized, the tacit or explicit cooperation of local landholders who controlled manpower, fortresses and supply. Vlad's earlier experience in 1448 had shown that foreign backing alone was insufficient. That lesson shaped the long years before 1456, as he worked to cultivate alliances and to wait for circumstances to present another opportunity. It is worth repeating the slow rhythm of these years. News arrived by courier, envoys were received in candlelit chambers, pledges were recorded in duplicate, accounts were kept. The political work of restoration was a succession of small acts performed over long periods, a contrast to the suddenness with which battles are sometimes described in later retellings. Part 6. The Prelude to 1456. A fresh opening came in the mid-1450s. Events in Hungary, particularly the changes following John Hunyadi's death in 1456, created a new situation in which rival claimants could attempt to press their advantages. Vlad took advantage of this shifting balance. Whether through new Hungarian contacts, renewed Ottoman arrangements, or a combination of both, he prepared an incursion into Wallachia in 1456 that would be more sustained than his earlier attempt. The mechanics of such a preparation were prosaic and slow, securing horses and riders, negotiating the loyalty of boyars who had shifted positions since 1448, ensuring that grain and fodder were available along the route, and timing the movement so that it would not be stricken by seasonal floods or impassable mountain snows. In August of 1456, the culminating movement occurred, and Vlad entered Wallachia with a force that managed to depose Vladislav II, and by 10 September he was writing as voivode to the burghers of Brasov, sending assurances of protection and making clear his intent to govern. In such letters we see the slow transition from claimant to ruler, the formalities, the petitions, the exchange of promises that anchored princely authority in everyday administration. Wikipedia +1 this preparatory phase is important to note because it shows how restoration was not merely the product of a single battle. It required logistical work, diplomatic labour, and the careful timing of action. The years of exile between 1448 and 1456 were therefore not wasted, but rather a long rehearsal for more sustained power, if the conditions at home allowed it. Part 7. Closing observations on 1448-1456, the pattern established by the first reign, its interruption, and the subsequent years of exile is instructive in slow, repetitive terms. A claimant can seize a throne when external conditions tilt in his favour. Holding it demands local support and administrative continuity. Withdrawal is as much a part of the landscape as seizure. Exile is not an absence but a slow series of practical negotiations and preparations. The years between 1448 and 1456 show Vlad learning these mechanics of power, learning also about the limits of foreign patronage, and slowly preparing for a more consolidated rule after 1456. This chapter, therefore, ends in a quiet, practical way, with a sequence of movements, of letters, of gifts, and of small military musters that together produced a renewed accession. It closes with the understanding that while 1448 had been brief and instructive, the 1456 accession that followed would be the moment when Vlad would attempt to translate the lessons of exile into a sustained program of government, adjusting to the old realities of boyar power, foreign suzerainty, hold reality, and the administrative needs of Wallachia. The next chapter will follow, in the same measured tone, the consolidation of authority in 1456 and the policies Vlad enacted once back on the throne. Part 2. The consolidation after 1456 opening. The transition from claimant to ruler by August of 1456. Vlad had crossed into Wallachia once more. By September, letters were issued under his name, bearing the tone of a prince who was no longer in exile, but the occupant of the throne. On 10 September 1456, one such letter reached the burghers of Brasov, assuring them of protection for trade routes and signalling his willingness to correspond in the formal and transactional style expected of a Wallachian voivode. This type of correspondence marked the practical beginning of rule, It was not proclamations to armies, but carefully worded assurances to towns and markets that confirmed a prince's presence. The immediate months after August-September 1456 were marked by a sequence of acts that were neither dramatic in the moment nor unusual in the context of Wallachian succession politics. They were repetitive, administrative, and necessary: removal of rivals, demonstration of authority, and cultivation of allies through promises of order and protection. Purges of opponents when a claimant secured the throne. The danger was not the initial seizure, but the lingering presence of boyars and households aligned with the previous ruler. These households commanded men, fortifications, and influence in local assemblies. Vlad addressed this reality in a way that later chroniclers recorded with a mixture of emphasis and exaggeration, but the underlying pattern was simple. In the weeks following September 1456, he identified boyars who had supported Vladislav II or who had shown wavering loyalty during earlier conflicts. Some were executed, others stripped of property, and others displaced from positions of authority. The mechanics of such purges were slow and procedural. Names were discussed, messengers summoned individuals, decisions were recorded. The executions were carried out not in secrecy, but in a manner intended to make the change of authority visible. Chroniclers in German-speaking lands would later describe mass killings. Slavic accounts would emphasize the severity of his punishments. In either case, the process began here. In autumn 1456 is an administrative clearing of opposition. This repetitive rhythm of early reigns, consolidation through purges, was characteristic of Wallachian politics. Princes who did not neutralize their opponents quickly were liable to lose the throne within months. Vlad had learned from 1448 that the presence of strong boyar families without demonstrated loyalty was a liability, and thus his early months in 1456 were marked by deliberate acts of removal. Administrative reorganizations alongside the purges came the quieter reorganization of court offices and local administration. The Wallachian voivodate required officials to manage tribute payments to the Ottomans, negotiations with Hungarian envoys, and the steady inflow and outflow of goods through Transylvanian passes. Vlad restructured the positions of vorniks, high administrators, treasury officers, and military captains. These reorganizations did not create entirely new institutions. Rather, they replaced unreliable men with others, often drawn from boyar households that had chosen to support him. Records suggest that he paid careful attention to placing loyalists in charge of revenue collection and in the supervision of border fortresses along the Danube. The repetition here is significant. New reigns always entailed new appointments, but for Vlad the lesson of exile meant that loyalty and proven usefulness outweighed lineage or prestige. The effect of such reorganizations was gradual. Clerks copied names onto new lists. Taxes were redirected to new officials. Envoys who had once travelled to one noble house were instructed to travel to another. The changes spread slowly across the principality, becoming routine over the course of the winter of 1456-1457. Relations with the Transylvanian Saxons, settlers of German origin who lived in towns like Brasov and Sibiu, were crucial intermediaries in trade. They controlled markets where Wallachian cattle, grain, and raw materials could be exchanged for cloth, metal goods, and salt. Their location also meant that Saxon towns were potential allies or opponents in military conflicts. Vlad's letter to Borisov in September 1456 emphasized protection of merchants and routes. It was a calculated message, intended to assure the burghers that trade could continue without disruption. This was necessary because his earlier exile years had included periods of tension with these same towns. By promising safe passage, he attempted to bind them to his administration with the ordinary guarantees of commerce. Nevertheless, relations with the Saxons were never simple. They had ties to Hungarian magnates, and their autonomy allowed them to resist Wallachian influence when they deemed it inconvenient. Thus, the correspondence of 1456 was the opening of a slow, uneven negotiation that would continue throughout Vlad's reign. Each side measured the other by the practical terms of markets, tolls, and caravan safety. The burghers of Brasov occupied a special position in this relationship. Located near mountain passes, it served as a hub of both trade and political communication. Letters sent to Brasov in the months after Vlad's accession carried multiple meanings. They were guarantees for merchants, signals to Hungarian authorities, and messages to Wallachian boyars that their new ruler was recognized by an influential urban centre. The burghers of Brasov kept their own records. These records, which survive in archives, provide glimpses of Vlad's early communications. They show him adopting the cautious, transactional language that characterized interactions between voivodes and Saxon towns. He spoke of protection, of assurances, of mutual obligations. The tone was not fiery but formulaic, reflecting the bureaucratic style of cross-border correspondence. Early measures to secure rule beyond purges and letters, Vlad's first months also included practical steps to ensure the functioning of the principality. Tribute payments to the Ottoman Empire had to be maintained. Failure to deliver would invite punitive raids. Correspondence with Hungarian leaders had to be established, since Hungary remained a neighbour capable of intervention. Fortresses on the Danube needed provisioning with grain, salt and water to prepare for potential incursions. These measures unfolded slowly. Registers were updated, storerooms inventoried and guards stationed. The daily life of the court involved clerks writing out orders, messengers delivering commands to captains of fortresses, and priests recording ceremonies of oath-taking. Vlad's rule in late 1456 did not rest on grand gestures alone, but on the repeated, mundane acts of administration. Closing of Part 2, thus the immediate months after August-September 1456 were marked not by singular dramatic events, but by sequences of actions. Purging opponents, reorganizing offices, issuing letters to burghers, and ensuring provisions. Each act was part of a rhythm that repeated itself in Wallachian history whenever a new voivode took the throne. For Vlad, however, these measures were shaped by the memory of his brief 1448 seizure. He acted more firmly against boyar opponents, placed greater emphasis on loyalty in appointments, and treated correspondence with Transylvanian towns as a central pillar of stability. The narrative remains slow and procedural: letters, appointments, purges, and provisioning. It is in these repetitive actions that one sees the consolidation of his authority in late 1456, setting the stage for the more systematic policies he would pursue in the years that followed. Part 3. The years 1457-1459, Justice, Taxation and the Question of Control opening. From initial consolidation to early governance by the beginning of 1457, Vlad had moved beyond the immediate tasks of purges, reorganizations, and letters of assurance. He was now in the position of administering a principality that required ongoing attention. The everyday demands of governance extended beyond survival. They included the collection of taxes, the regulation of justice, the supervision of markets, and the management of relations with towns and boyars alike. The period between 1457 and 1459 is significant because it shows Vlad shifting from reactive measures of survival to proactive measures of control. These measures, although later described in chronicles with exaggeration, were in fact composed of slow, routine acts repeated month after month. Systems of justice. Justice in mid-15th century Wallachia was not codified in modern legal terms, but was administered through princely authority, customary law, and the decisions of appointed officials. In this period, Vlad became known for his insistence on order and his readiness to punish disobedience. Contemporary accounts, particularly from German and Slavic sources, record that Vlad used public punishments to reinforce authority. Impalement was the method most frequently associated with his reign. But the core fact was less about the method itself, and more about the consistency with which he enforced penalties. Boyars who disobeyed, merchants who defrauded, peasants who stole, and envoys who broke terms could all be subjected to harsh punishment. The psychological effect of this severity was deliberate. A principality with shifting loyalties and porous borders required visible demonstrations that the voivode's word would be upheld. Thus, between 1457 and 1459, a pattern emerged. Disputes were brought before the prince, decisions were rendered swiftly, punishments followed. Records indicate that this was not random but structured. Vlad positioned himself as the final authority, bypassing some of the old boyar privileges of arbitration. The repetition of this practice week after week gave it a rhythm of normalcy in his court. Taxation and fiscal demands. The administration of taxation in Wallachia was essential both for domestic expenses and for external obligations. Tribute to the Ottoman Empire remained a requirement, even when princes resisted it in principle. Additionally, maintaining fortresses, supporting a standing guard, and funding small campaigns demanded a steady flow of resources. Vlad increased fiscal demands during these years. Peasants paid in kind, grain, livestock, honey, and wax, while merchants paid in coin for the right to trade across borders. Toll stations were positioned at roads leading to mountain passes, ensuring that merchants from Transylvania and beyond contributed to Wallachian revenues. German pamphlets of the period, hostile to Vlad, described his taxation as oppressive. Yet, when considered in context, these measures were not unusual for a frontier principality. The repetition of payments, collections, and audits was part of the mundane routine of governance. Officials kept registers, couriers delivered receipts, and village elders ensured compliance. What distinguished Vlad was his insistence that failure to pay could be met with severe punishment, reinforcing fiscal compliance through fear. Control over boyars. The relationship between the voivode and the boyars remained tense throughout these years. Boyars had historically enjoyed privileges, including influence over princely succession and exemptions from certain obligations. Vlad sought to reduce their autonomy. Between 1457 and 1459, chronicles report repeated purges and forced relocations of boyar families. Some were executed, others were compelled to build fortresses or work on labor projects. The purpose of such measures was not merely punitive but structural, to reduce the independent power of the nobility and to assert that the voivode was the primary authority in the land. This campaign against boyars was carried out slowly and deliberately. Summons were issued, gatherings were convened, individuals were singled out. Execution or confiscation followed. The repetition of this cycle created a climate in which boyars hesitated to act independently. Later stories of large banquets followed by executions reflect the general pattern of systematic reduction of boyar power during these years. Relations with the Saxons at the same time, relations with the Transylvanian Saxons became more strained. In 1457 and 1458, trade disputes arose, particularly concerning merchants accused of undermining Wallachian economic interests. Vlad reacted firmly, targeting Saxon merchants and settlements near the frontier. German pamphlets later amplified these episodes, portraying them as cruelty, yet the underlying reality was that trade disputes often escalated into political confrontations. Vlad's approach combined letters of warning with acts of reprisal. When towns refused to cooperate, he ordered punitive actions against their merchants or caravans. Such measures were not extraordinary in the frontier context, but they were carried out with consistency and severity. Each caravan stopped, each merchant fined or punished, sent a repetitive signal. Wallachia was not to be bypassed in trade agreements. The routine of governance, the daily routine of Vlad's court during these years included the following: meetings with officials to review tax registers. Issuance of orders to fortress commanders along the Danube. Reception of envoys from Hungary and Moldavia. Oversight of disputes among peasants and merchants. Repeated inspections of boyar loyalty. These tasks were not singular events but recurring acts performed over months and years. The rhythm of governance in 1457-1459 was marked by repetition. Each season, grain was collected. Each month, caravans passed through mountain passes. Each week, petitions were heard and punishments carried out. Closing of Part 3 by the end of 1459, Vlad had established a reputation for severity, order, and control. His methods, justice through harsh punishment, taxation enforced rigorously, and boyar autonomy curtailed, were consistent and repetitive. Relations with the Saxons remained tense, and chronicles outside Wallachia began to portray him as a figure of cruelty. Yet, within the principality, these years represented a consolidation of authority. For the first time, Vlad was not merely holding power by chance or foreign patronage, but shaping the structures of administration to reflect his priorities. The next phase of his reign would extend these policies further, bringing him into sharper conflict with both neighbours and overlords. Part 4. The years 1459-1460. Conflict with the Saxons, preparations on the Danube, and the continuation of boyar campaigns opening. From internal consolidation to external confrontation by 1459, Vlad had already established the foundations of his rule through purges of rivals, fiscal reforms, and rigorous control over his boyars. Yet his principality was not insulated. Wallach's geography ensured constant contact with powerful neighbours. The Kingdom of Hungary to the northwest, the Ottoman Empire to the south, and the independent-minded Transylvanian Saxon towns to the north. The years 1459 and 1460 mark a phase in which internal consolidation overlapped with external confrontation. Vlad's rule had become routine within his borders, but his assertive measures now began to touch neighbouring regions more directly. The slow unfolding of conflict can be traced in three interrelated spheres: the towns of the Saxons, the fortresses along the Danube, and the ongoing reduction of boyar independence. The Saxon question, the Saxons of Transylvania had long been both trading partners and rivals of Wallachia. Their towns, Brasov, Sibiu, and others, served as gateways for commerce across the Carpathians. Yet these same merchants often supported rival claimants to the Wallachian throne, particularly from the Dansti line, who promised favourable privileges in exchange for political backing. In 1459, tensions deepened. Vlad accused Saxon merchants of harbouring exiled boyars and of plotting with rival pretenders. In response, he initiated punitive expeditions. These expeditions were not large-scale campaigns but repeated raids directed at villages, caravans, and trading routes. Each raid sent a message: Wallachian sovereignty was not to be challenged. German pamphlets of the later 16th century, drawing on these episodes, describe scenes of extreme cruelty: burned settlements, impaled merchants, confiscated goods. While the accuracy of these accounts is debated, the repetition of hostile measures is not. Each season of 1459 and 1460 brought renewed tension, with Saxon envoys petitioning Hungarian authorities for protection, while Vlad responded with force. The Danube preparations at the same time, the Ottoman Empire remained a constant presence to the south. Tribute was still expected, yet Vlad's correspondence indicates that he sought to reduce dependence and to prepare for resistance. In 1459, he began strengthening fortresses along the Danube. Gorju, Jiu, Tanu, and others were stocked with supplies and garrisons. Patrols were organised to monitor crossings. Small river flotillas, equipped with boats suitable for fast movement, were prepared to intercept Ottoman raiders. These preparations were not isolated acts, but part of a pattern repeated across months. Couriers carried orders to commanders. Labourers transported stone and timber. Villages provided provisions. The slow and steady build-up reflected Vlad's recognition that Wallachia's survival depended on readiness. By 1460, Ottoman envoys complained of Wallachian resistance to tribute collection. Vlad alternated between negotiation and defiance, sometimes paying delayed sums, sometimes refusing altogether. The repetition of this cycle strained relations and foreshadowed the open conflicts to come in the early 1460s. Campaigns against boyars within Wallachia itself. Vlad continued his campaign against boyar independence. Though many prominent families had been purged earlier, resistance persisted in scattered form. Some boyars conspired with the Saxons, others communicated secretly with the Ottomans, still others attempted to maintain private armies. Between 1459 and 1460, Vlad summoned gatherings of boyars under the pretext of consultation, only to arrest or punish those suspected of disloyalty. Confiscated estates were redistributed to loyal retainers or incorporated into the princely domain. The repetition of such measures eroded the collective power of the nobility. Each season witnessed new arrests, new executions, new transfers of land. By the end of 1460, the once fragmented authority of the principality had been drawn more directly into the hands of the voivode. Hungarian and regional context, meanwhile, Hungary observed these developments with mixed concern. King Matthias Corvinus had interests in ensuring that Wallachia remained a buffer against Ottoman expansion. Yet Vlad's harsh measures against the Saxons, subjects of the Hungarian crown, created tension. Letters and envoys passed repeatedly between Buda and Targov East, debating the limits of Wallachian autonomy. Vlad justified his actions as necessary to maintain order and sovereignty, while Hungarian officials pressed for moderation. The cycle of complaint, reply, and temporary resolution defined relations during this period. The rhythm of 1459–1460, the daily and seasonal rhythm of Vlad's rule in these years can be summarised. Spring and summer campaigns against Saxon villages and caravans. A continuous Danube fortification with supplies carried by villagers and soldiers stationed in garrisons. Regular boyar purges with executions, confiscations, and redistribution of estates. Tribute disputes with the Ottomans, alternating between refusal, delay, and limited payment. Correspondence with Hungary, marked by petitions, complaints, and defensive explanations. This rhythm was not exceptional in its structure, but notable for its consistency. Each year repeated the same patterns: assertion of authority, confrontation with neighbours, and vigilance against betrayal. Closing of Part 4. By the close of 1460, Vlad's principality stood both more secure and more embattled. Internally, boyar power had been reduced, taxation and justice had been enforced with severity, authority was centralised. Externally, however, hostility with the Saxons had deepened, and tension with the Ottomans had sharpened. Hungary too grew wary of Vlad's uncompromising stance. The years 1459–1460 thus prepared the ground for the dramatic confrontations of the early 1460s, when Wallachia would no longer be able to maintain the delicate balance between submission and defiance. Vlad's methods, harsh, repetitive, and uncompromising, had secured his authority at home, but they also ensured that foreign powers now regarded him with suspicion and hostility. Chapter 7. The confrontation with the Ottoman Empire, 1461–1462. Introduction. By 1461, Vlad III of Wallachia stood at a crossroads. His position within the principality had become relatively stable after years of purges, fortifications, and campaigns against boyars and Saxon rivals. Yet the wider geopolitical situation made stability fragile. The Ottoman Empire continued to press for tribute, supplies, and recognition of suzerainty. Hungary, under Matthias Corvinus, monitored Wallachia's actions carefully, weighing whether Vlad's resistance to the Ottomans aligned with or conflicted with Hungarian interests. Thus, the years 1461 and 1462 became decisive. They were not years of quiet consolidation, but years when Wallachia's confrontation with the Ottoman Empire could no longer be postponed. Preparations for conflict were undertaken, rivers and fortresses became focal points of defence, and raids escalated into larger campaigns. 2. Section 1. Political background. In 1461, the year 1461 opened with continued disputes regarding tribute. The Ottomans had expected regular payments, typically consisting of gold, livestock, and other goods, delivered in scheduled intervals. Vlad, however, increasingly resisted these demands. Some payments were delayed, others were refused outright. Envoys from the Sultan were received but often dismissed without satisfaction. At the same time, Hungarian diplomacy created additional complications. Matthias Corvinus, although officially aligned with the defence of Christendom, was cautious. His kingdom faced its own internal challenges, and he could not afford open war with the Ottomans unless conditions were favourable. Vlad's defiance therefore placed Hungary in a difficult position, either to support a Wallachian prince who risked provoking the Sultan, or to distance itself from him. Letters from these years show repeated exchanges. Ottoman envoys accused Vlad of rebellion. Hungarian emissaries urged moderation. Wallachian responses emphasized sovereignty and the burden of excessive demands. The cycle repeated itself with each season. Section 2. Preparations along the Danube. Recognizing that confrontation was inevitable, Vlad turned his attention to the Danube frontier. Fortresses such as Giurgiu, Turnu, and Chilia became focal points of construction and supply. Timber was cut from forests, stones were transported, and labourers were compelled to work under state direction. At the same time, flotillas were organised, boats were built or seized, equipped with oars and sails, and stationed along the riverbanks. Garrison forces were rotated, ensuring that each stronghold maintained watch. Couriers moved between fortresses, relaying orders. Villages were required to provide provisions: grain, salted meat, wine, and fodder. Peasants transported these supplies in carts or by river barge. Records indicate that such provisioning became a routine obligation, repeated at set intervals, regardless of weather or harvest conditions. Thus, month by month in 1461, the Danube frontier became increasingly militarized. The landscape changed, with earthworks rising, walls strengthened, and patrols made constant. Section 3. Campaigns of 1461. In the latter part of 1461, Vlad initiated offensive measures. Raids were conducted across the Danube into Ottoman territory. These raids were not limited to single episodes but formed a series of operations, striking at settlements, warehouses and garrisons. Ottoman records describe villages burned, captives taken and supplies destroyed. The Wallachian aim was not only punitive but also preventative. By destabilizing the frontier zone, Vlad hoped to deter larger Ottoman incursions. The pattern repeated itself through the seasons: winter raids when the river froze, spring raids when supplies were abundant, summer raids when crops could be destroyed, and autumn raids when harvests could be seized. Each phase reinforced the perception of hostility between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire. Section 4. The year 1462 and the night attack by 1462, tensions reached their peak. The Sultan, Mehmed II, prepared for direct intervention. His armies, already experienced in sieges and campaigns, advanced toward the Danube with the aim of subduing Wallachia. Vlad, anticipating invasion, employed scorched earth tactics. Villages were evacuated, fields were stripped, and wells were poisoned. These measures slowed Ottoman progress but caused immense hardship to the Wallachian population. The most well-known episode of this year occurred in June 1462, often referred to as the night attack. According to chronicles, Vlad organised a nocturnal assault on the Ottoman camp near Targovist. The aim was to strike at the Sultan himself, though the attempt failed. Accounts describe confusion, burning fires, and clashes in the dark. German pamphlets and Slavic chronicles emphasise the scale of this assault, though in monotonous detail it can be reduced to a single fact. The Ottomans were forced into temporary disorder, but the Sultan survived. The confrontation revealed both Vlad's boldness and the limitations of his forces against a superior army. Section 5. Aftermath and strain following the night attack, Ottoman forces regrouped. Wallachian villages continued to suffer, both from enemy devastation and from the burdens imposed by their own ruler. Peasants were compelled to maintain watch, transport supplies, and abandon their homes. Livestock was requisitioned. Harvests were lost. By the end of 1462, Wallachia faced exhaustion. The campaigns had not destroyed the principality, but they had exposed its vulnerability. Hungarian intervention remained uncertain. The Ottomans, though temporarily checked, continued to threaten. Thus, the years 1461 and 1462, which began with preparation and escalation, ended in strain and precarious survival. Vlad's principality had resisted, but at great cost, leaving the question of succession and foreign relations more unsettled than before. Part 2. Aftermath of the night attack and the strain on Wallachia, the immediate aftermath following the events of June 1462, when Vlad's nocturnal assault temporarily disrupted the Ottoman camp. The Wallachian countryside entered a phase of heightened tension. The Sultan, Mehmed II, though not captured or killed, experienced enough resistance to reconsider his immediate plans. His army had been disturbed, some detachments had suffered losses, and the advance through a scorched and depopulated land had proven more burdensome than anticipated. Consequently, the Ottoman forces began a gradual withdrawal. This retreat was not a panicked flight, but a slow movement back across the Danube, marked by continued skirmishes and acts of devastation. Fields were burned, villages were plundered, and captives were taken. Yet the withdrawal left behind an exhausted Wallachia, whose resources had been consumed both by defence and by destruction. The condition of the countryside by the second half of 1462, Wallachia displayed the signs of deep strain. Harvests had been interrupted by the military campaigns. Many villages lay abandoned, their inhabitants dispersed into forests or taken prisoner. Livestock numbers were reduced, either seized for military purposes or lost during raids. Travellers' accounts, though sparse, describe stretches of countryside where fields lay fallow, roads were empty, and only garrisons at fortresses remained visibly active. The peasantry bore the weight of recovery, rebuilding homes, replanting fields, and restoring herds. Yet the repeated burdens of taxation and requisition made recovery slow. Famine and hunger followed. Grain reserves had been consumed by soldiers, seed stores were depleted. Malnutrition weakened communities and disease, often accompanying famine, spread. spread. Chronicles mention outbreaks of plague in parts of the region, though the details remain uncertain. Whether epidemic or localized sickness, the effect was the same. Population decline and hardship, the diplomatic confusion at the same time. Vlad faced a more complex political situation. His defiance of the Ottomans had been bold, but it left him dependent on support from Hungary. Yet Matthias Corvinus hesitated. While he praised resistance to Ottoman expansion, he also balanced relations with the Sultan and listened to complaints from the Saxons, who continued to protest Vlad's earlier campaigns against them. By late 1462, rumours and accusations circulated widely. German pamphlets and Saxon chronicles portrayed Vlad as excessively cruel, emphasising his use of impalement. Ottoman accounts described him as treacherous and rebellious. Wallachian supporters defended him as a protector of sovereignty. The mixture of reports created confusion in European courts. Thus, Vlad's image shifted from that of a defender of Christendom to that of a controversial and unreliable ally. The same campaigns that had disrupted the Ottomans also alienated neighbouring powers. The strain on governance within Wallachia, Vlad's authority was maintained, but the cost of continuous war weakened confidence. Boyars who had been subdued now faced the same losses as peasants: depleted estates, reduced labour, and strained revenues. Some quietly reopened contacts with rival factions, including those aligned with the dynasty line, hoping to secure more stable leadership. Taxation remained heavy. Peasants, already short of supplies, were required to contribute additional resources for rebuilding fortresses and maintaining garrisons. Repetition of levies led to fatigue and resentment. Administration became repetitive in form but limited in effect. Orders were issued, supplies collected, punishments enforced. Yet the underlying resources of the principality diminished, creating a cycle in which decrees became harder to implement. The larger picture: by the end of 1462, Wallachia had resisted an Ottoman invasion, inflicted damage on enemy forces, and temporarily preserved its autonomy. Yet this outcome was ambiguous. Victory was incomplete, recovery was uncertain, and political isolation deepened. The Sultan had not been defeated permanently, only delayed. Hungary had not offered decisive support, only cautious engagement. The Saxons remained hostile, the boyars remained unreliable. Thus, the confrontation of 1461-1462 left behind not triumph, but precarious survival. Wallachia endured, but its ruler now faced challenges that extended beyond open warfare: the erosion of resources, the suspicion of neighbours, and the slow recovery of a traumatised countryside. Closing the chapter on these years may therefore be summarised as one of confrontation followed by exhaustion. Vlad had struck boldly, organised resistance, and achieved temporary success, but the long-term effects were weakening. The land bore scars, the people endured hunger, and diplomacy faltered. From this point forward, Vlad's position became less secure, preparing the stage for his eventual downfall, imprisonment, and displacement. Interlude: the pamphlets, chronicles, and the making of the Dracula image introduction before turning to the events of 1462 and Vlad's downfall. It is useful to pause and examine the ways in which his reputation was shaped beyond the borders of Wallachia. The period of his reign coincided with the rise of printing in German-speaking lands and with an increased circulation of pamphlets, broadsheets, and chronicles. These documents, often produced in cities like Nuremberg, Lübeck, and Augsburg, provided distant readers with stories of Vlad's actions. Although these stories were not always accurate, they were repeated, copied, and expanded. Over time, they formed one of the earliest reputational legends in European history. The slow, repetitive retelling of tales of cruelty, of impalement, and of punishment transformed a regional prince into a continental figure of fear. Section 1. The Saxon motivation. The Saxons of Transylvania, especially those in Brasov and Sibiu, had particular reasons to portray Vlad negatively. Their merchants had been attacked, their caravans had been confiscated, and their villages had been raided during Vlad's campaigns of 1459-1460. When exiled boyars and rival claimants to the Wallachian throne sought refuge in Saxon towns, the stories of Vlad's punishments multiplied. These stories were passed orally in marketplaces, repeated in council chambers, and eventually recorded in written form. By the early 1460s, Saxon hostility produced a steady stream of accusations. Vlad was said to impale merchants, burn entire villages, and enforce cruel punishments for even minor offences. Each story reinforced the image of a ruler who was feared rather than respected. Section 2. German pamphlets and printing. The invention of the printing press allowed these accounts to spread more widely. In German cities, pamphlets describing Dracula, Dracula, or simply the Tyrant of Wallachia were printed and sold. These pamphlets were usually short, ranging from a few hundred to a few thousand words. They were printed on inexpensive paper and distributed at fairs and markets. The style was simple and repetitive. One anecdote followed another, each more severe than the last. Among the most common stories were those of impalement of Saxon merchants who refused to pay taxes, mass executions of peasants and boyars suspected of betrayal, cruel punishments such as boiling, burning, or mutilation. While the accuracy of these tales is uncertain, their repetition created a firm image of Vlad in the minds of readers. The stories were not told with nuance, but with flat certainty, as if each account were self-evident. Section 3. The Ottoman chronicles. Ottoman sources also contributed to the shaping of Vlad's reputation. Chroniclers writing for the Sultan emphasized his treachery, noting his refusal to pay tribute, his raids across the Danube, and his attacks on Muslim communities. Descriptions of impalement were included in these chronicles, not as exaggerations for entertainment, but as warnings of the danger posed by an unpredictable frontier ruler. To Ottoman readers, Vlad was not a folk villain, but a rebel whose methods justified stern retaliation. These accounts were copied in court records, repeated by scribes, and preserved in archives. Their tone was administrative and factual, but the details of cruelty remained. Section 4. Western European reception. In Western Europe, where direct contact with Wallachia was limited, the pamphlets and chronicles formed the primary image of Vlad. To readers in Germany, France, and Italy, the name Dracula became associated not with geography or dynastic politics, but with cruelty itself. Travellers who visited the courts of Hungary or the Saxon towns of Transylvania often carried back these stories. Repeated in letters, retold in chronicles, and copied into manuscripts, the image of Vlad spread slowly across Europe. This circulation followed the rhythms of late medieval communication: merchants travelling to fairs, clerics copying texts, nobles exchanging letters. Each act of copying added small changes, but the core image remained the same. Section 5. The function of propaganda. It is important to note that these stories served a function. For the Saxons, they justified resistance against Vlad and appealed for protection from the Hungarian crown. For the Ottomans, they explained the need for military campaigns. For Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, they later provided evidence that Vlad was too dangerous and too cruel to remain an ally. Thus, the pamphlets were not neutral records. They were tools of diplomacy and justification. Their repetitiveness gave them authority, and their circulation gave them permanence. Section 6. A reputation formed by the early 1460s. Even before Vlad's imprisonment, his image as a Dracula, the cruel, had taken root. It was an image shaped less by Wallachians themselves and more by external voices: Saxons seeking protection, Ottomans recording rebellion, Hungarians justifying policy, and German printers selling sensational stories. Each pamphlet, each chronicle, each repeated anecdote added a layer to the legend. The historical Vlad III furled a small principality on the Danube frontier, but the literary Vlad Dracula became a figure of continental imagination. Closing of the interlude. This interlude shows that reputation is not always the product of deeds alone, but of how those deeds are recorded, repeated, and circulated. Vlad's campaigns against the Saxons, his defiance of the Ottomans, and his punishments of boyars all provided material. Yet it was the pamphlets, chronicles, and scribes that gave his name the weight it still carries. With this background in mind, we can now return to the chronological narrative. The year 1462 did not only bring military strain, it also brought Vlad's downfall, his flight to Hungary, and his imprisonment under Matthias Corvinus, a sequence of events that would be influenced directly by the reputation built through propaganda. Chapter 8. The Campaign of 1462 and the Fall of Vlad. Section 1. the Ottoman decision to invade by the beginning of 1462, Vlad's position in Wallachia was already strained. His earlier raids across the Danube into Ottoman territory, particularly the campaigns of 1461, had provoked a response of unusual scale. Reports reached the court of Sultan Mehmed II that villages had been burned, garrisons slaughtered, and Muslim subjects impaled. For the Sultan, who had taken Constantinople in 1453 and had positioned himself as the master of the Balkans, such actions could not remain unanswered. He resolved upon a campaign of direct intervention. The aim was not merely to punish Vlad for disobedience, but to replace him with a more compliant ruler. In this context, Mehmed identified Vlad's younger brother, Radu the Handsome, as a suitable candidate. Radu, who had spent years at the Ottoman court and who had converted to Islam, was seen as both loyal and pliant. His candidacy provided the Ottomans with a political alternative and a means of winning local support. Section 2. The Ottoman advance in the spring of 1462. Mehmed II advanced northward with an army reported by sources to be vast, numbering perhaps over 100,000 men, though such figures are probably exaggerated. Alongside the Ottoman forces came contingents from allied vassals, including Moldavia and Serbia. The Ottoman army moved deliberately. Bridges were constructed, supplies were gathered, and camps were established along the Danube. Their approach was not sudden but careful, signalling that this was not a mere raid but a planned campaign of conquest. Vlad, in contrast, commanded a smaller force. His Wallachian army consisted of local levies, boyar retainers, and mercenaries. His strategy could not be to meet the Ottomans in open battle, but rather to delay, harass, and frighten them. Section 3. The night attack, the most famous episode of this campaign, occurred in June 1462 during what has become known as the night attack at Targovist. As the Ottoman army encamped not far from the Wallachian capital, Vlad launched a surprise assault under cover of darkness. His forces penetrated the Ottoman lines, setting fire to tents, killing soldiers, and creating confusion. The aim, according to chroniclers, was to strike directly at the Sultan himself, whose tent was said to be targeted. Though Mehmed escaped, the attack inflicted casualties and sowed fear. Ottoman chronicles describe the chaos of that night in vivid detail, emphasizing fire, shouting, and disorder. German pamphlets later exaggerated the episode further, presenting it as a scene of almost supernatural ferocity. Yet, despite the drama, the attack did not alter the strategic balance. The Ottomans remained in the field, and Vlad's forces remained too weak to force them into retreat. Section 4. Psychological warfare and impalements in the aftermath of the night attack. Vlad sought to weaken Ottoman morale by arranging gruesome displays. Chroniclers record that when Mehmed's forces advanced toward Targovist, they encountered a forest of the impaled, a field in which thousands of Ottoman prisoners had been executed and displayed on stakes. This spectacle, while intended to terrify, also confirmed the image of Vlad as a ruler defined by cruelty. To his enemies, it was evidence of barbarity. To his supporters, it was a symbol of determination. Nevertheless, the psychological effect did not achieve lasting military advantage. The Ottomans, though unsettled, continued their operations. Their numerical superiority remained decisive. Section 5. The emergence of Radu the Handsome. While Vlad harassed the Ottoman army, Radu the Handsome gained ground in Wallachia. Supported by the Sultan, Radu presented himself as a more moderate alternative. Many Wallachian boyars, long resentful of Vlad's harsh measures, shifted their allegiance to Radu. His promises of leniency, his Ottoman backing, and his personal charm all played a role. Gradually, villages and towns opened their gates to him, and local nobles deserted Vlad's cause. Thus, the conflict was not decided solely on the battlefield. It was also a political struggle in which loyalty, survival, and pragmatism led many Wallachians to abandon the reigning prince. Section 6. Vlad's retreat. By late summer of 1462, Vlad's position had collapsed. With the Ottoman army pressing forward and with Radu gaining recognition within Wallachia, Vlad was forced to retreat. He fled northward, seeking refuge first in Transylvania and then in Hungary. His plan was to appeal to Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary, who had previously supported him as an anti-Ottoman ally. Vlad hoped that his resistance to Mehmed II would be recognized as part of the broader Christian defense. However, his reputation, shaped by Saxon pamphlets and by accusations of cruelty, now worked against him. Instead of welcoming him as a hero, Matthias Corvinus regarded him as dangerous. Section 7. The imprisonment in late 1462 or early 1463, Vlad was arrested in Hungary. Sources disagree on the exact circumstances, but the outcome was clear. Matthias had him confined. The imprisonment was justified publicly with documents, likely forged, that portrayed Vlad as plotting with the Ottomans. These documents, whether genuine or not, provided Matthias with political cover. They allowed him to explain to Western powers why an anti-Ottoman prince was being held captive rather than supported. Vlad remained in captivity for many years. His life in prison was not one of complete neglect. He was housed in various Hungarian fortresses, sometimes under relatively lenient conditions, but his freedom and his throne were lost. Section 8. Consequences. The campaign of 1462 marked a turning point. Vlad had risen to prominence through his defiance of the Ottomans and his ruthless assertion of control within Wallachia. Yet the very methods that brought him power, fear, severity, and violence, also contributed to his downfall. Radu the Handsome now ruled Wallachia under Ottoman protection. Maimed too had demonstrated his ability to intervene directly across the Danube. Matthias Corvinus had turned from ally to jailer. Vlad's name, however, did not fade. While he remained a prisoner, pamphlets and chronicles continued to circulate, repeating tales of cruelty, exaggerating anecdotes, and fixing his reputation as a Dracula. Chapter 8, Part 2. Imprisonment and the Growth of a Reputation. Section 1. The initial captivity, when Vlad was first taken into custody by King Matthias Corvinus in 1462, the imprisonment was not immediately severe in the sense of dungeon-like conditions. The precise location of his confinement is disputed in the sources. Some accounts suggest that he was held at Visegrad, the fortress overlooking the Danube north of Buda, while others propose that he may have been kept in more than one residence during different periods. The justification given for his arrest rested on documents that allegedly showed Vlad's willingness to negotiate with the Ottomans. Whether forged or authentic, these papers gave Matthias the political grounds to present Vlad not as a loyal anti-Ottoman ally, but as a dangerous opportunist. In this way, the king avoided criticism from the papacy and from Western rulers who might otherwise have questioned the detention of a Christian prince who had resisted the Turks. In the early years of captivity, Vlad's treatment was closer to house arrest than harsh imprisonment. He was kept under guard, his movements restricted, and his capacity to command troops or issue orders effectively nullified. Section 2. The Visegrad fortress and daily conditions. The fortress of Visegrad, where he was likely held for part of his captivity, was a royal residence with substantial stone walls, towers and chambers arranged along the Danube's banks. It served both as a defensive stronghold and as a site of ceremonial residence for Hungarian monarchs. For a prisoner like Vlad, this meant that while his freedom was curtailed, his environment was not that of a dark cell, but rather of controlled confinement. Rooms with windows, guards posted at entrances, and the constant surveillance of royal officials defined his existence. Daily life in such captivity would have been monotonous. Meals provided by the royal household were of adequate quality. Hungarian records suggest that prisoners of status were supplied with bread, meat, vegetables, and occasionally wine. Clothing was furnished, and attendants may have been assigned. Yet the lack of political agency, the absence of military command, and the humiliation of dependence upon his former ally weighed heavily upon Vlad's pride. Section 3. Shifting degrees of freedom. Over the years, Vlad's imprisonment underwent phases of greater and lesser severity. Some chronicles suggest that at times he was kept under strict guard, unable to leave designated chambers, while at other times he was permitted more movement, even appearing at the royal court in Buda. This variation reflected both the shifting needs of Matthias Corvinus and the changing political landscape. When Matthias required Vlad as a symbolic ally against the Ottomans, he relaxed restrictions, presenting him as a Christian warrior unjustly maligned. When circumstances dictated otherwise, Vlad's freedom was curtailed again. It is likely that by the 1470s, Vlad's confinement had become more lenient, allowing him to marry and even to participate in minor political functions. Section 4. the growth of the Dracula legend while Vlad remained in captivity, his reputation continued to expand far beyond the fortress walls. In German-speaking lands, pamphlets and woodcut prints circulated with lurid accounts of his cruelty. These stories, based partly on real events but exaggerated and embroidered, painted Vlad as a figure of monstrous brutality. Accounts described mass impalements, boiling of prisoners, mutilations, and even fictitious tales of cannibalism. The pamphlets were printed in Nuremberg, Lübeck, and other centres of early printing. They reached a wide audience, and the repetition of their themes fixed Vlad's name as synonymous with cruelty. At the same time, in Slavic and Ottoman sources, Vlad was remembered with a mixture of fear and respect. Chronicles in Moldavia and Russia sometimes portrayed him as a stern defender of order, while Ottoman writers emphasized his brutality toward captured soldiers and civilians. Thus, as Vlad's personal agency diminished in Hungary, his symbolic presence in European imagination grew. Section 5. Psychological consequences. Captivity for more than a decade inevitably had psychological consequences. While precise details of Vlad's mental state are unknown, chroniclers and later commentators noted his increasing severity, his mistrust of others, and his fixation on harsh punishments. It is possible that years of confinement, alternating between hope of release and renewed restriction, hardened his temperament further. When he eventually returned to Wallachia, his methods showed no sign of moderation, suggesting that imprisonment did not soften his character. Section 6. Marriage and family connections. During the later phase of his captivity, Vlad was married to a relative of King Matthias Corvinus, most likely a cousin or a member of the royal household. This marriage not only bound him more closely to the Hungarian royal family, but also provided him with a degree of legitimacy that could be used should he one day return to the Wallachian throne. Such alliances were not unusual. Marriages were a political instrument, used to tie claimants to reigning dynasties and to secure loyalty. For Vlad, the union represented both an acknowledgement of his status and a sign that Matthias still considered him potentially useful. Section 7. Duration and impact. From 1462 until approximately 1475, Vlad remained a captive, sometimes in stricter, sometimes in looser confinement. For 13 years he lived outside his homeland, watching as Wallachia passed under the rule of his rivals, including his brother Radu the Handsome. The impact of this long absence was profound. Vlad lost direct control of Wallachia's institutions, the loyalty of many boyars, and the ability to shape events in the region. Yet, paradoxically, his fame in Europe continued to grow. The longer he remained imprisoned, the more stories circulated, reinforcing his reputation as both a tyrant and a defender of Christendom. Section 8. Prelude to release. By the mid-1470s, the balance of power shifted once again. The Ottoman threat continued to press against Hungary, and Matthias Corvinus sought reliable military leaders to defend his frontier. In this new context, Vlad's experience and ferocity, once considered dangerous, became valuable. Thus, after years of confinement, Vlad's prospects for release improved, negotiations were undertaken, military conditions reconsidered, and the idea of restoring Vlad to the Wallachian throne re-emerged as a possibility. Chapter 8, Part 3. Rehabilitation and Preparation for Return. Section 1. The changing circumstances of the 1470s. By the mid-1470s, conditions in Eastern Europe had altered in ways that opened new possibilities for Vlad. The Ottoman Empire remained a powerful and expanding force, continuing campaigns deep into the Balkans and pressing against both Hungary and Moldavia. The long struggle between Christian rulers and the Sultan had reached a stage where experienced commanders were increasingly sought after. At the same time, the political landscape within Wallachia remained unstable. The rule of Radu the Handsome, while supported by the Ottomans, was not universally accepted. Boyar factions shifted, villages experienced economic hardship, and loyalties were divided between Ottoman authority and Hungarian influence. In this uncertain setting, Vlad, though long imprisoned, remained a figure of potential importance. His reputation for severity, his lineage as the son of Vlad II Dracula, and his prior role as a prince of Wallachia gave him claims that could still be invoked. Section 2. The Hungarian calculations for King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. The mid-1470s were a period of defensive strategy. Ottoman incursions threatened Hungarian fortresses along the Danube. The need for leaders who could command troops effectively was pressing. Although Vlad had once been regarded as too dangerous to trust, his qualities now appeared useful. He was experienced in guerrilla warfare, familiar with Ottoman tactics, and hardened by years of conflict. His severity, while once condemned, could be reinterpreted as determination. Thus, Matthias began to adjust his approach. The confinement of Vlad became less restrictive. He was granted greater movement, permitted to participate in limited military activities, and even consulted in discussions concerning Wallachia. Section 3. Military rehabilitation. There are indications that Vlad was gradually reintegrated into military service during this period. Though exact records are sparse, some chronicles suggest that he was allowed to accompany Hungarian forces in campaigns, perhaps in a subordinate or advisory role. This served a dual purpose. It tested his loyalty under controlled circumstances, and it allowed him to demonstrate his usefulness. Each step toward military involvement also helped to rebuild his reputation as a warrior rather than merely a prisoner. For Vlad, this rehabilitation meant a slow return to the life of command. After more than a decade of restricted movement, he once again experienced the camp, the march, and the preparation for battle. Section 4. The marriage connection. Vlad's marriage to a woman connected to the Hungarian royal household further strengthened his position. The alliance ensured that his rehabilitation was not merely functional, but also dynastic. By linking himself to the family of Matthias Corvinus, he gained an element of legitimacy that could not be easily dismissed. Marriage in this context was less about personal relations and more about political integration. It tied Vlad to Hungary's ruling elite, reducing the appearance of him as an isolated exile and reframing him as a partner, however subordinate, in Hungary's defense strategy. Section 5. Regional alliances and Wallachian prospects at the same time. External conditions created opportunities for Vlad's return. In Moldavia, Stephen the Great, voivode since 1457, had established himself as a significant regional power. His own campaigns against the Ottomans positioned him as both an ally and a rival to Hungarian interests. Venice and other Western powers also continued to encourage resistance to Ottoman expansion. Appeals for crusades were frequently circulated, though actual coordinated action was rare. In such appeals, figures like Vlad could be presented as potential champions of the cause, their reputations repurposed for Christian propaganda. Within Wallachia, dissatisfaction with Ottoman overlordship created openings for a leader who could promise order and independence. Although boyars remained cautious, the memory of Vlad's earlier reign, with its strict discipline and relative autonomy from outside powers, still lingered. Section 6. The path toward restoration. By 1475, these factors converged. The Ottomans continued to advance, threatening Hungarian security. Matthias Corvinus, needing strong allies, began to consider re-establishing Vlad in Wallachia. Support from Moldavia was tentatively available, provided Vlad would align with Stephen the Great against the Ottomans. For Vlad, this was the long-awaited opportunity. After 13 years of confinement and gradual rehabilitation, he prepared to return to his homeland. His release was not the result of sudden generosity, but of strategic necessity. Thus, the stage was set for Vlad's final reign, which would begin in 1476 under circumstances of uncertainty, danger, and fragile alliances. Interlude. The economy of Wallachia in the 1470s. Section 1. Agricultural patterns. In the 1470s, Wallachia's economy remained primarily agrarian. The majority of the population consisted of peasants who cultivated land either under boyar authority or as tenants on ecclesiastical estates. Wheat was the most significant grain crop, providing the staple for bread, which formed the basis of daily diet. Alongside wheat, barley and oats were widely planted, serving both as food and as fodder for animals. The climate patterns of the 1470s, as far as can be reconstructed, followed the established cycle of cold winters, wet springs, and hot summers. Periods of drought occasionally reduced yields, while excess rain could damage fields and rot stored grain. Harvests required large amounts of manual labour, performed by families and village communities. Surpluses were minimal, and a poor harvest in one year frequently meant hardship in the next. Viticulture was practiced in the hill regions, especially where soil and slope allowed vineyards to flourish. And grapes were pressed into wine, which was consumed locally and also exported in limited quantities to nearby towns. Orchards with apples, plums and walnuts supplemented agricultural production, though these were more seasonal and less reliable. Section 2. Animal husbandry livestock formed an important part of the rural economy. Cattle were raised for both milk and meat, but also as draft animals pulling carts and ploughs. Sheep were especially numerous, valued for wool, meat and milk used in cheese-making. Leto. Pigs roamed freely in forested areas, feeding on acorns and roots. Horses, though less numerous, played a vital role in transportation, cavalry service and prestige. The distribution of animals was uneven. Wealthier boyars owned large herds, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, while peasants kept smaller numbers sufficient for household needs. The management of flocks often required seasonal migration to better pastures, a routine that tied communities to cycles of movement and labour. Taxes were levied in kind as well as in coin, and livestock often formed part of the tribute exacted by both local rulers and foreign overlords. Section 3. Coinage and barter. Monetary circulation in Wallachia during the 1470s was mixed. Hungarian gold florins, widely respected for their stability, were used in larger transactions. Ottoman silver aspers circulated as well, particularly in southern regions under stronger Ottoman influence. Wallachian issues of coinage were relatively limited, and local exchange often relied on barter. Peasants traded grain, animals, wool and hides for tools, salt and cloth. Markets functioned as nodes where coin and barter intersected, with local officials supervising weights, measures and payments of tolls. Section 4. Trade routes connected Wallachia to neighbouring regions. The Transylvanian towns of Brasov and Sibiu were central to commerce. Merchants from these towns carried cloth, metal goods, wine and luxury items southward, receiving in exchange grain, cattle, hides and wax. The Danube ports, though contested between Ottoman and Hungarian influence, also served as outlets for trade. Grain and livestock could be transported downriver, while goods from the Black Sea and the wider Ottoman world travelled upstream. Roads remained basic. Dirt tracks hardened by repeated use, sometimes impassable in wet seasons. Carts, pack animals and river transport were the principal means of movement. Bridges were few, and ferries across rivers charged tolls. Section 5. Taxation and obligations. The economic burdens on Wallachian peasants were significant. They owed dues to their local lords, including a portion of harvests, labour services, and payments in kind. To the voivode, they paid general taxes that sustained the princely household, military obligations, and administrative expenses. The church collected tithes, often in the form of grain, wine or animals. In addition, Wallachia paid tribute to the Ottoman Empire, a requirement that weighed heavily on the treasury and ultimately on the population. This tribute, originally moderate, tended to increase with Ottoman demands. Thus, a peasant family might owe obligations to a landlord, the prince, the church, and foreign overlords simultaneously. The cumulative effect left little room for prosperity. Section 6. Market life, weekly markets and annual fairs punctuated the economic calendar. Villagers brought surplus goods to towns, while merchants sold tools, salt, iron goods and cloth. Marketplaces were also social spaces where news circulated and disputes were settled. Customs duties were levied on goods entering towns. Boyars often sought exemptions from such dues, while common traders were required to pay them in full. Seasonal fairs, often linked to religious festivals, attracted larger gatherings. These fairs provided opportunities for longer distance merchants, sometimes including Greeks, Armenians and even Italians, to participate in exchange. Section 7. Economic pressure and political consequences. The economy of the 1470s was therefore marked by subsistence, moderate trade and heavy burdens. Droughts, floods and locust swarms could quickly upset the fragile balance. Periods of famine were not rare, and in such times peasants fled their villages, reducing the tax base of boyars and the voivode alike. These pressures influenced politics. Boyars who lost income from estates sought rulers who would ease taxation. Princes, needing revenue for defence and tribute, often increased levies, provoking resentment. Thus, economic conditions fed directly into the instability of Wallachian rule. Section 8. Transition toward Vlad's return. As Vlad prepared for his return in 1476, these economic realities formed the backdrop. Any ruler of Wallachia faced the same constraints: limited surpluses, heavy obligations, and the constant balancing of Hungarian and Ottoman demands. Vlad's reputation for severity promised order, but order came at the cost of harsher control. The Wallachian economy of the 1470s was therefore both the stage upon which his final reign unfolded and the structural limits that no voivode could escape. Chapter 9. The Final Reign of 1476, Part 1. The return to Wallachia by 1476, the political map of southeastern Europe had shifted once again. The Ottoman Empire, still under Mehmed II, pressed northward along the Danube and deepened its influence in the Balkans. 4. The Kingdom of Hungary, ruled by Matthias Corvinus, remained the principal Christian counterweight in the region. Moldavia, under Stephen the Great, stood as another determined, though smaller, Christian principality resisting Ottoman encroachment. It was in this environment that Vlad received the opportunity to reclaim the Wallachian throne. His years of imprisonment in Hungary, followed by gradual rehabilitation, had left him dependent upon the goodwill of Matthias. When relations between Hungary and Moldavia aligned against the Ottomans in the mid-1470s, the prospect of restoring Vlad to power became politically useful. His reputation for severity, long a liability, was now reframed as a potential asset, a ruler harsh enough to discipline Wallachia and loyal enough to hold the frontier for Hungary. The campaign of 1476 was thus planned as a combined effort. Matthias Corvinus lent his support, though cautiously, while Stephen of Moldavia provided military aid. Their aim was not merely to restore Vlad, but to install a ruler capable of resisting Ottoman advances and stabilizing Wallachia's volatile politics. Part 2. The march into Wallachia, the expedition to place Vlad on the throne, required coordination between Hungarian and Moldavian forces, supplemented by Vlad's own supporters and remnants of loyal boyar factions. The march southward encountered both logistical and political challenges. Wallachia, exhausted by decades of conflict and heavy taxation, provided little in the way of surplus resources. Armies moved slowly, dependent upon requisitioned supplies and uncertain local support. Opposition came from within as much as from without. Radu, the handsome Vlad's younger brother and rival, had occupied the throne under Ottoman auspices. His rule, though weakened, still commanded loyalty from boyars who preferred the security of Ottoman protection to the uncertainty of Vlad's harsh justice. Switching allegiance was a calculation of survival, not conviction, and many waited to see which claimant would prevail before committing themselves. By late autumn of 1476, Vlad succeeded in re-entering Wallachia. With the support of Hungarian and Moldavian allies, and with Ottoman-backed forces temporarily checked, he was proclaimed voivode once again. Part 3. The nature of his final rule, the return of Vlad to power, was marked by both triumph and fragility. He reclaimed the title of voivode, but his authority rested less on domestic strength than on external support. The boyars, long accustomed to shifting loyalties, did not welcome him with enthusiasm. Memories of past purges and punishments lingered, and many feared the severity of his justice. The economy of Wallachia, still burdened by tribute and depleted by war, offered little with which to sustain prolonged campaigns. The treasury was thin, the villages weary, and the nobility divided. To rule effectively, Vlad would have needed time to rebuild the structures of discipline and fear that had once underpinned his authority. Time, however, was not granted to him. Even within months of his restoration, reports suggest that Ottoman-backed forces and internal opposition began to press against him. The frontier along the Danube remained vulnerable, and the loyalty of boyars remained doubtful. And the Moldavian and Hungarian allies who had installed him withdrew, their objectives largely satisfied once their armies had returned north. Vlad was left exposed in a land where the instruments of his former power were weakened, and where the balance of force favoured his enemies. Part 4. Toward the end thus, the final reign of Vlad the Impaler in 1476 was brief, perhaps only a matter of weeks or months. It represented the culmination of his long career, but also its fragility. Unlike his earlier reigns, where violence and determination could secure obedience for several years, this last return lacked the resources and stability necessary for consolidation. The stage was set for his downfall, which followed swiftly. Chapter 9. Contextual subsection. Boyar politics in 1476. The political environment of Wallachia in 1476 was marked by the same structural tensions that had shaped the principality for more than a century. The boyars, or noble landholders, formed a class whose power derived from their estates, their armed retainers, and their ability to align with external powers, whether Hungary to the north, the Ottoman Empire to the south, or Moldavia to the east. Their loyalty to any given voivode was never absolute, but rather conditional, shifting with circumstance, personal advantage, and fear of reprisal. By the 1470s, the distribution of boyar loyalties reflected both geography and history. Northern boyars, settled in estates close to the Carpathian foothills and in proximity to Transylvanian trade routes, often leaned toward alliances with Hungary. Their estates profited from exchanges with Saxon towns like Brasov and Sibiu, making their economic fortunes tied to stability along the Hungarian frontier. Southern boyars, whose lands bordered the Danube plain, were more exposed to Ottoman raids and taxation. Many of these nobles had been compelled over decades to negotiate accommodations with Ottoman officials, either through tribute, protection payments, or occasional military service. Their pragmatism made them inclined to support voivodes who maintained workable relations with the Sultan. Fulton. Central boyars, those whose estates lay in the fertile valleys between the Carpathians and the Danube plain, occupied a more uncertain position. Their revenues derived from agriculture and internal trade, and they adapted to whichever overlord promised stability. They were susceptible to influence from both north and south, and thus tended to shift allegiance with greater frequency. The Dansti faction, a rival princely line with long-standing claims to the throne, remained present as well. Their influence had declined by 1476, yet their historical role in encouraging noble dissent and providing alternative claimants still affected political behaviour. When Vlad was restored to the throne in 1476 with Hungarian and Moldavian backing, the boyars responded cautiously. Some swore oaths of loyalty, but the sincerity of these oaths was doubtful. Memories of past purges, when Vlad had executed, impaled, or otherwise punished members of the nobility, remained vivid. Even boyars who might have favoured independence from Ottoman control hesitated, aware that their lives and estates could be endangered under a restored Vlad. The Boyar Council, or Svatul Domnesk, retained a formal role in governance, advising the voivode and representing the interests of the higher nobility. In practice, however, its effectiveness depended upon the ruler's strength. During Vlad's earlier reign in the 1450s, he had curtailed the influence of this council through executions and intimidation. By 1476, weakened by years of imprisonment and reliant on foreign allies, Vlad no longer commanded the same fear or authority. As a result, boyars felt emboldened to delay, to negotiate, and to await outcomes rather than binding themselves firmly to his cause. The Ottomans exploited this uncertainty. Envoys, merchants and spies circulated promises of protection to those boyars willing to abandon Vlad. Conversely, Hungarian and Moldavian envoys attempted to reinforce his legitimacy. The competing pressures created a climate of hesitation where nobles avoided irreversible commitments until the military balance became clear. Thus, the boyar class of 1476 cannot be described as united in loyalty to Vlad. Rather, it was divided into cautious factions, each waiting to see whether Ottoman-backed Radu or Hungarian-backed Vlad would emerge dominant. This atmosphere of hesitation and mistrust ensured that when military crisis came, Vlad lacked the domestic support base necessary to endure. Part 2, Campaigns, Ottoman counterattacks, and the death of Vlad, the restoration of Vlad III to the Wallachian throne in late 1476, was fragile from the outset. Installed with Hungarian and Moldavian assistance, he returned to a principality still contested by Ottoman-backed forces and divided among uncertain boyars. After his proclamation as voivode, Vlad sought to consolidate his rule by preparing defences and asserting authority across the land. Reports suggest that he attempted to secure garrisons along the Danube crossings, particularly near Giurgiu and Târnu, where Ottoman incursions were frequent. Yet his means were limited. The Wallachian treasury was depleted, and the nobility offered only lukewarm support. By the end of the year, Ottoman counteraction began in earnest. Radu the Handsome, still supported by maimed Radu, returned with Ottoman auxiliaries and sympathetic Wallachian boyars. The confrontation that followed was not a single decisive clash but a series of engagements, skirmishes, and shifting positions. Vlad attempted to rally loyal forces, but the balance of manpower and resources weighed against him. Accounts vary concerning the exact circumstances of his final battle, but most traditions agree that it occurred near Bucharest or in its surrounding plains during the closing weeks of 1476. The field conditions, described by later chronicles, were unfavourable. Winter approached, supplies were thin, and morale was uncertain. Some boyars defected, others hesitated, and only a portion remained loyal. The fighting ended in Vlad's defeat. He was killed, though the manner of his death is reported differently in various sources. Some chronicles claim he fell in battle, cut down in combat against Ottoman-supported forces. Others suggest betrayal, with boyars turning upon him in the confusion. The precise detail cannot be fixed with certainty, but the outcome was the same. Vlad III, voivode of Wallachia, met his end in the final weeks of 1476. His head, according to several Ottoman accounts, was severed from his body and sent to Constantinople. There, it was displayed to Mehmed II as proof of the victory and the removal of a persistent adversary. His body was buried, though even here traditions diverge, some claiming the monastery at Snagov, others suggesting a grave near Kamana. Thus ended the life of Vlad III, known to later generations as Vlad Tepes or the Impaler. His reign, restored only briefly in 1476, collapsed under the combined pressure of Ottoman power, boyar division, and the exhaustion of Wallachia itself. His death closed a turbulent career that had spanned intermittent decades, filled with struggle, imprisonment, and restoration, but ending in isolation and defeat. Chapter 10. Legacy and Memory Part 1. Immediate reactions after 1476. In the months and years following the death of Vlad III 1476, his memory was shaped not only within Wallachia, but also across the surrounding regions. His allies, particularly in Moldavia under Stephen the Great, regarded him as a fallen comrade in the struggle against the Ottomans. Stephen himself continued his campaigns into the 1480s, often recalling the sacrifice of Wallachian leaders who had resisted Ottoman power. Yet within Wallachia, the recollection was more divided. For some boyars, Vlad's death removed a feared master, one who had inflicted punishments and executions without hesitation. For others, his loss represented the passing of a strong ruler who, despite his harshness, had defended the principality with determination. The peasantry, who bore the burden of taxes and labour obligations, likely remembered him in contradictory ways, both as a punisher and as a protector, depending upon local circumstance. The Ottomans, by contrast, viewed his death as the removal of an adversary who had disrupted their control along the Danube frontier. The presentation of his head to Mehmed II symbolised not merely a battlefield victory, but the elimination of a figure who had built his reputation on resisting Ottoman authority. Part 2. The German pamphlets and the construction of an image outside the region. Particularly in German-speaking lands, Vlad's memory took a very different form. Beginning in the late 15th century, a series of printed pamphlets circulated that described his deeds in vivid and exaggerated detail. These pamphlets, among the earliest products of the printing press, often portrayed Vlad as a cruel tyrant whose punishments exceeded ordinary imagination. The accounts included long lists of executions, impalements, and acts of severe justice. While some were based on actual incidents from his reign, others appear to have been expanded or invented for effect. These stories found an eager audience in Central Europe, where tales of distant rulers combined both moral warning and entertainment. The repeated emphasis on impalement earned Vlad his enduring epithet, Tepes, meaning the impaler. The pamphlets served several purposes. Politically, they justified opposition to Vlad by neighbouring Saxon towns, which had suffered under his economic and military pressure. Culturally, they reflected the appetite for cautionary tales of tyrants and the dangers of unchecked power. Technologically, their circulation demonstrated the power of the new print medium to shape reputation across borders. Part 3. The Slavic and Ottoman traditions in Slavic chronicles, particularly those of Russia and the Balkans. Vlad's reputation was also recorded, though in somewhat different tones. Some Orthodox sources described him as a stern but just ruler, one who enforced order even if through terrifying means. In certain accounts, his severity was framed as a necessary instrument of governance, a ruler who punished dishonesty, theft, and rebellion without exception. The Ottoman chronicles, by contrast, emphasized his role as an enemy of the empire. They recorded his raids across the Danube, his night attacks, and his refusal to submit peacefully to Ottoman demands. In these accounts, he appeared as a dangerous opponent, remembered not only for cruelty but also for cunning resistance. Part 4. Later folklore and the emergence of Dracula over the centuries, Vlad's memory merged with folklore. In Romanian villages, stories circulated that portrayed him as both fearsome and protective, a ruler who punished the corrupt boyars and defended the poor from injustice. These traditions often emphasized the fairness of his cruelty. Though harsh, he applied punishments equally to nobles and peasants. In Western Europe, however, his image evolved differently. The publication of later chronicles, coupled with the continuing influence of the German pamphlets, preserved his reputation as a figure of extraordinary cruelty. By the 19th century, when romantic interest in the medieval past revived, Vlad's name was associated with dark legend. It was during this period that his identity was connected with the literary figure of Dracula, created by Bram Stoker in 1897. Although Stoker's novel drew only loosely upon the historical Vlad, the association was strong enough to cement his place in global culture as a Count Dracula. The transformation was not based on direct continuity of folklore, but rather on the convergence of earlier printed legends, later historical research, and the imaginative needs of Gothic fiction. Part 5. Historiography and modern memory in modern historical writing. Vlad III has been interpreted in multiple ways. Romanian historians of the 19th and 20th centuries often presented him as a national hero, emphasizing his defense of independence against Ottoman encroachment. Western historians, drawing on the pamphlets and chronicles, frequently emphasized his cruelty and the spectacular nature of his punishments. More recent scholarship has sought to balance these perspectives, situating Vlad within the harsh political realities of 15th-century Eastern Europe and Europe. His methods, though extreme, were not unique in a region where rulers struggled constantly to maintain authority amid external invasion and internal treachery. His legend, however, outgrew his history, shaped by print, folklore, and later literature. Part 6. Concluding reflections. The legacy of Vlad III of Wallachia is thus a layered one. Within his lifetime, he was a prince among many, ruling a small principality on the edge of larger empires. His reigns were short, interrupted, and marked by both resistance and submission to greater powers. His death in 1476 was not unusual for the time, yet his memory was preserved in ways that far exceeded his political significance. Through pamphlets, chronicles, and stories, he became a symbol, sometimes of tyranny, sometimes of justice, sometimes of resistance, and finally of the supernatural. His name, transformed into the fictional Dracula, achieved a form of immortality denied to most rulers of his age. Yet behind the myth stands the history. A land of forests and rivers, of boyars and peasants, of tribute and rebellion, of hunger and harsh winters. It is within that setting that Vlad lived and ruled, and it is through that setting that his story, slow and repetitive, has been told. Epilogue. A slow reflection. This book has moved slowly, very slowly, across many chapters. It began with the land itself. We described Wallachia, Transylvania, and the Ottoman frontier. We spoke of rivers and mountains and plains. We described the winters and the summers. We noted the rains and the droughts. We spoke of the crops, of barley and of wheat and of vines. We describe the lives of peasants, of houses with wooden roofs, of clothing made from wool and linen, of the routines of farming, and of the markets and roads that carried trade. Then we turned to politics. We spoke of Hungary and its taxation. We spoke of the Ottoman Empire and its administration. We spoke of Moldavia and its alliances, and of Venice and Poland at the edges. We saw how powers large and small pressed upon Wallachia, a principality caught in the middle. for principality caught in the middle. We then spoke of family. We described Vlad II Dracula. We spoke of the Order of the Dragon. We traced the early years of his son, Vlad III. We described his hostageship in the Ottoman court. We described food and clothing at that court. We spoke of discipline, of fear, of rivalry, of his brother, Radu. We moved then to his first reign and the interruptions that followed. We slowed our pace to describe boyar politics. We described noble families, their estates, their loyalties and their betrayals. We saw how they shifted again and again from one master to another. We followed Vlad through his reigns, through his harsh punishments, through his wars against the Saxons, and through his preparations along the Danube against the Ottomans. We spoke of impalement, though in a flat and neutral way, without horror, without drama. We spoke of justice, taxation, and control. We traced his downfall in 1462, his flight, his imprisonment under Matthias Corvinus. We described the Saxon pamphlets, the early propaganda, the stories that made his cruelty known across Europe. We described the long years of his captivity, the gradual rehabilitation, and his return to Wallachia in 1476. We described his final reign, brief and fragile, supported by Hungary and Moldavia, opposed by the Ottomans and divided boyars. We described the campaigns and his death. We described his head sent to Constantinople and his body buried in uncertain places. We concluded with legacy. We described the German pamphlets. We described Slavic chronicles. We described Ottoman accounts. We described Romanian folklore. We described Bram Stoker and the transformation of Vlad into Dracula. We described historians both older and modern who have written of him as tyrant, as defender, or as symbol. And now, slowly, we close. Vlad's life was short, interrupted, and violent. His reputation was long, exaggerated, and transformed. What remains is not only the myth, but also the history, preserved in chronicles, in pamphlets, in records, and in memory. This concludes our slow telling, our long repetition, our calm narration of a life that became a legend, If you have listened until the end, and if you wish to hear more stories told slowly, more boring histories told for rest and for sleep, you may subscribe to this channel. Subscribing helps you return again to hear more voices of the past, told slowly, told quietly, told in a way that may help you rest. And now we are finished. The story is complete. The voice grows quiet. The history of Vlad the Impaler has been told.